Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, the place where we take the ordinary things around us, turn them over slowly, and discover that they are usually much stranger than they first appear. Tonight, or this morning, or whatever ambiguous hour has found you, I want to begin with this simple question. Where are you listening from right now? Maybe you're in bed with the lights off. Maybe you are on a late train, half watching your reflection in the window. Maybe you are folding laundry, pretending this is a deeply intellectual activity and not just a long negotiation with socks. Wherever you are, take a moment and look around. Or if your eyes are already closed, just picture the room. The walls, the ceiling, the quiet corners, the objects you stopped noticing a long time ago. Now ask yourself something slightly stranger. How much of what is actually here are you really detecting? Because it is entirely possible, in fact overwhelmingly likely, that your experience of the room around you is only a thin, tidy, edited version of what is actually going on. Not wrong exactly, just incomplete. Extremely useful, yes, comfortingly stable most of the time, but incomplete in a way that is hard to appreciate until you stop and really think about it. You may feel as though you are sitting inside a solid, familiar world, taking in reality as it is, yet your senses are only sampling a narrow band of what exists, and your brain is doing what it has always done best: trimming, simplifying, guessing, discarding, and stitching together a manageable picture it hopes will keep you alive and relatively on schedule. And if that sounds a bit dramatic, don't worry. We are not opening with a claim that your teacup is haunted by invisible dragons, or that your hallway contains an interdimensional bus stop. This is a quieter kind of mystery, and in many ways a more unsettling one. The idea is not that reality hides from us in some theatrical fashion, ducking behind curtains and whispering ominously. It may be hiding in the plainest possible way. It may be present all the time, so constant, so outside the range of what we notice, that it never even registers as something we ought to question, not because it is cleverly concealed, but because we are not equipped to see it for what it is. Before we wander deeper into that thought, and I do think wander is the right word, because this is one of those subjects that rewards a slower pace, let me offer the gentlest of invitations. If you enjoy this sort of calm exploration, if this helps settle your mind rather than wind it up, then do give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me for the journey. There is something very satisfying about looking at the world you already know and realizing it has been keeping secrets, not out of malice, but simply because you never had the tools to ask the right questions. The strange thing is that most of us grow up with the feeling that perception is straightforward. You open your eyes, and there is the world. You hear a sound, and there is the source. You touch a table, and there is the table, solid and dependable and exactly as it appears. Your senses in this everyday understanding function like windows, perhaps not perfect windows, but decent ones, clear enough to get the job done. The trouble is that this picture gives us a little too much confidence. Our senses are not neutral windows onto reality. They're more like highly selective reporters with tiny notepads, limited deadlines, and a habit of leaving out anything that doesn't seem immediately relevant. Your eyes, for example, do not reveal all light. They reveal a very narrow sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum, a tiny band that human evolution happened to find useful. Visible light is only a small portion of what is out there. Beyond red is infrared, which many animals can sense more effectively than we can. Beyond violet is ultraviolet, visible to creatures whose world includes patterns and signals we simply do not perceive. Bees can see markings on flowers that act like landing guides. Birds can detect ultraviolet reflections in feathers and landscapes. Snakes can sense heat in ways that make our own abilities seem embarrassingly basic. To a bee, a flower is not what it is to you. To a snake, a mouse in darkness is not hidden in the same way. To many animals, what we call reality would feel stripped down, muted, missing key information. And hearing is no better in this respect. Human hearing is limited to a particular frequency range. We do not hear ultrasonic calls used by bats or many high-pitched signals used by other creatures. We do not hear infrasound the way elephants can, those very low vibrations that travel long distances through ground and air. A place that seems silent to you may be, by another standard, full of communication. A field can be busy. A forest can be busy. Even your home can be busy in ways you will never consciously register. Pipes tremble, electronics hum, floors expand and contract, air moves through vents, distant engines send low vibrations through walls. There is no such thing as a truly simple silence, only a silence calibrated to the limitations of human ears. The same is true of smell, though we often underestimate how strange that sense really is. Dogs, as everyone knows, live in what seems to be a completely different chemical universe. To a dog, a patch of pavement is not just pavement. It is recent history, social drama, weather report, biological archive, and perhaps an overlong neighbourhood newsletter. We step past all of this, detecting almost nothing, feeling pleased with ourselves for locating coffee from 2 rooms away. What seems featureless or empty to us may be dense with information in another sensory world. That phrase, sensory world, is worth lingering on. Because one of the easiest mistakes to make is to assume that reality is fully present, and different species merely notice different parts of the same obvious picture. But many scientists and philosophers have suggested something more radical, that each creature inhabits its own meaningful version of the world, shaped by what it can detect, what it can ignore, and what it has evolved to care about. A tick, for instance, is not interested in sunsets, architecture, or your opinions about productivity. Its world is built from cues like heat, scent, and position. A bat's world is structured by echo and movement in darkness. A fish experiences pressure, current, chemistry, light, and vibration in combinations that are difficult for us to imagine from the inside. We tend to think of ourselves as receiving reality in its full official edition, with perhaps a few pages missing. It may be closer to the truth to say we each get our own selective summary, and humans, for all our intelligence, are not exempt from that arrangement. In some ways, we are unusually trapped by it, because we are so good at smoothing over the gaps. Your brain is not merely receiving sensory data, it is interpreting it, editing it, predicting what should be there, and often deciding what can safely be ignored. This is not a flaw, it is the only reason you can function. If your nervous system tried to consciously process every photon, every sound frequency, every subtle movement in your peripheral vision, every pressure change, every smell molecule, every detail of texture and temperature and internal sensation all at once, you would not achieve enlightenment. You would probably just panic in a highly philosophical manner, so the brain filters, constantly, ruthlessly. It throws away information before you ever become aware of it. It builds shortcuts, it looks for patterns, it decides what matters and what does not. It assumes continuity, it fills in blanks, it offers you a version of reality that is simplified enough to navigate but rich enough to feel complete. That feeling of completeness is one of its cleverest tricks. The experience is seamless, which is exactly why it is so convincing. You can see hints of this in everyday life. Have you ever walked into a room and failed to notice something obvious until someone points it out? A book moved to the wrong shelf, a picture hanging crooked, a pair of glasses sitting in plain sight while you search everywhere except the exact place they are. This is not merely absent-mindedness, though humanity has built an impressive cultural tradition around misplacing things that are directly in front of us. It reflects a deeper truth. We do not inspect the world evenly. We sample it according to expectation, relevance, and habit. If the thing does not fit the pattern your brain is currently prioritizing, it can effectively vanish from awareness. Psychologists have a term for one famous version of this: inattentional blindness. When attention is engaged in one task, people can fail to notice something striking happening right in front of them. Perhaps the best-known example is the experiment in which participants focus on counting passes in a ball game, and many entirely miss a person in a gorilla suit walking through the scene. It sounds ridiculous until you experience it, and then it becomes deeply humbling. The gorilla is not hidden. The viewers are not blind in the medical sense. The information reaches the eyes. It simply does not become part of conscious perception in the way we assume it should. The mind, busy with one assignment, lets the improbable pass through like an unimportant detail in the background. That should probably trouble us more than it does. Because if attention can erase something so blatant under laboratory conditions, what else disappears in ordinary life, not once, but constantly? What have we trained ourselves not to see because it is too consistent, too subtle, too unfamiliar, or too unimportant to the goals of the moment? Your brain is always running a quiet economy. It does not want to spend valuable resources processing what it considers noise. Unfortunately, noise is only another name for data we have not yet learned how to use. Even your sense of a stable visual world is partly manufactured. Your eyes do not hold still and absorb a perfect scene like camera lenses in a very patient documentary. They dart rapidly in tiny movements called saccades, sampling different parts of the environment. During these jumps, your visual perception is partially suppressed, so the world does not seem to smear and jerk every time your gaze shifts. The result is a smooth experience, but that smoothness is assembled. The continuity you feel is not simply handed to you by the world. It is produced by active neural work, frame by frame, moment by moment. The world feels steady because your brain is an accomplished editor with an excellent sense of continuity, and that editing goes far beyond movement. Colour itself, that thing we treat as one of the most obvious properties of objects, is not sitting out there in the world in the tidy way it seems. Light of different wavelengths reflects off surfaces, yes, but the colour you experience depends on context, contrast, illumination, and interpretation. The same object can appear dramatically different under different lighting conditions, yet your brain compensates to preserve stability. It tries to maintain the appearance of a consistent world, because a wildly shifting one would be inconvenient when trying to identify berries, recognize faces, or avoid walking into ponds. So if the brain is reconstructing so much, then the unsettling question follows naturally. What if something can be physically present, perhaps even continuously present, while slipping through the filters that shape ordinary awareness, not because it is supernatural, not because it violates physics, but because it falls outside the thresholds, categories, or assumptions that govern human perception? In that case, hidden would be the wrong word. Unregistered might be better. Think for a moment about all the things you already accept as real despite never sensing them directly. Radio waves, X-rays, magnetic fields, airborne microbes, neutrinos passing through your body by the trillions, the slow flexing of the Earth's crust beneath cities and fields, the constant movement of molecules in the air around you. You do not wake each morning and greet the electromagnetic spectrum in its glorious entirety. You do not detect Wi-Fi with your forehead, though given modern life I suspect some people would quite like that feature. These things are around you all the time, woven into your environment so thoroughly that only instruments reveal them, and once the instruments reveal them, they cease to feel magical and become part of the furniture of reality. That is an important point, because it helps remove some of the unnecessary drama. When we talk about hidden aspects of reality, the mind often leaps toward the fantastic. Secret dimensions, invisible beings, eerie presences hovering by the bookshelf. But reality does not need theatrical embellishment to be astonishing. The plain scientific version is already enough. There are layers of the world you do not sense. There are patterns you do not decode. There are phenomena that pass through and around you without your awareness. There are structures in your environment that only appear once you invent the right tools, concepts, or methods for noticing them. Human history is full of examples. Microscopes revealed bustling invisible life in drops of water. telescopes revealed that the heavens were not a neat dome of lights, but a vast, structured universe. Sensors revealed radiation, magnetism, fields, particles, waves, and countless processes that had always been present. The world kept turning. We were the ones catching up. Still, there is another layer to the mystery, and this one is more intimate. Because even when information does enter the senses, recognition is not guaranteed. Perception is not just detection, it is also interpretation. Your brain must decide what something is, whether it matters, and how it fits into the model of reality you already carry. If it cannot categorize the thing properly, it may mislabel it, minimize it, or dismiss it altogether. Humans are extremely pattern-driven creatures. We are good at seeing faces in clouds, shapes in shadows, meanings in noise, yet we're also very good at overlooking patterns that do not fit familiar templates. We can miss the obvious while inventing the doubtful. It is a versatile system, though not one I would necessarily describe as elegant. This is why familiarity can be such a powerful blindfold. The more ordinary a setting feels, the more confidently the brain predicts what belongs there. A kitchen is a kitchen. A road is a road. A bedroom is a bedroom. You stop inspecting. You stop asking. Most of daily life runs on successful prediction, and that is efficient. But efficiency is not curiosity. If something unusual were embedded in the ordinary, not loud enough to trigger alarm and not familiar enough to be named, it could sit in the margins for a very long time before anyone thought to investigate. There is a deep irony here. We like to imagine that hidden truths are concealed in remote places, underground vaults, deep oceans, distant galaxies, classified folders with dramatic stamps on them. And certainly some truths are. But others may remain undiscovered for the opposite reason. They are too close, too constant, too woven into the normal background of experience. They do not announce themselves. They blend with the assumptions through which we conduct daily life. The brain, wanting usefulness over completeness, waves them through without ceremony. This does not mean we are doomed to ignorance. Far from it. The human story is, in many ways, the story of extending perception beyond the body's built-in limits. We make microscopes because the eye is not enough. We make telescopes because distance defeats us. We make spectrometers, detectors, antennas, scanners, cameras tuned to wavelengths we cannot see, software that finds patterns our intuition misses, mathematical models that let us infer what cannot be directly observed. We surround our fragile animal senses with tools, and those tools steadily widen the edges of the known world. Every major scientific breakthrough carries a quiet message beneath the details. There was more here than we realized. And the really interesting part is that each expansion tends to humble us twice. First, because we discover something new. Second, because we realize it was there the whole time. Germs did not arrive when microscopes were invented. Radio waves did not begin when antennas were built. Ultraviolet patterns did not bloom into existence the moment humans learned to measure them. We uncovered what had never needed our permission to exist. So when we say there may be something hidden in plain sight, this is not just a spooky phrase or a philosophical decoration. It is a practical way of describing the relationship between reality and perception. The world does not owe us legibility. Evolution did not design human senses to reveal everything. It shaped them to reveal enough to find food, avoid danger, recognize allies, raise children, navigate terrain, and make it through another day with a reasonably intact skeleton. Truth in the broadest sense was never the main assignment. Survival was, and survival favors shortcuts, which means that somewhere between the raw abundance of reality and the neat little scene you consciously experience, a great deal is being left out. Some of it is harmless background detail. Some of it becomes visible with training. Some of it requires instruments. Some of it may still be beyond our current methods altogether. That possibility should not frighten us. If anything, it should make the world feel richer, less exhausted, less fully catalogued than we sometimes imagine. The familiar room is not less real because you detect only part of it. It is more real, more crowded with processes, signals, interactions, histories, and unnoticed structures than your daily awareness can comfortably hold. And once that idea settles in, even a little, the ordinary world starts to change shape. The air around you no longer seems empty. Silence no longer seems simple. Vision no longer seems complete. The neat border between what is present and what is absent starts to look less certain than it did a few minutes ago. You begin to suspect that reality is not withholding itself in some deliberate way. It is simply operating at scales, speeds, frequencies, and forms of significance that human perception was never built to fully capture. And that suspicion, once it takes hold, makes the next question hard to avoid. If our senses give us only a useful sketch of the world, and if the brain is constantly reducing, filtering, and reconstructing what reaches it, then the place to begin is not out in some distant mystery at all, but here, with the strange bargain your body made with reality from the very start, and with the very small slice of existence it decided would be enough for you to call a world. That small slice is what we usually call normal, and the word itself does far more work than we tend to notice. Normal sounds modest, practical, almost innocent. It gives the impression of something obvious and natural, something that simply exists in the world waiting to be observed. This is normal light, normal sound, normal experience, normal size, normal temperature, normal behavior. But the deeper you look, the less solid that word becomes. Normal is not the full shape of reality. It is the portion your body can handle, the portion your brain can organize, and the portion your culture has quietly agreed to treat as everyday life. Most people move through the day with the feeling that the world arrives already sorted. There is foreground and background, signal and noise, object and empty space, meaningful and irrelevant. The chair is a chair, the room is a room, the air is just air. The passing hum outside is traffic. Probably, unless you live somewhere remote enough to hear that sentence and feel briefly superior. Everything appears to come labelled in advance, as though reality were kind enough to include captions. Yet those labels are not supplied by the universe. They are supplied by minds trying to simplify a much larger and messier field of information. The version that reaches awareness is the one your nervous system considers survivable. That point matters because we sometimes flatter ourselves into thinking perception is mainly about accuracy. It is not. Accuracy helps, of course, but usefulness is the real priority. The brain is not a philosopher sitting quietly in a study, determined to perceive truth in its fullest and most uncompromising form. It is more like an exhausted but competent manager trying to keep a chaotic operation running with limited staff and no extra budget. It cuts corners, it delegates, it uses assumptions. It says, in effect, this is probably close enough, and very often close enough is all we ever experience. That is why normal can feel so convincing. It is not random. It is stable enough to trust, consistent enough to navigate, and shared enough that other people mostly confirm it. You point to the sky and say blue, and other people nod. You call a room quiet, and unless someone is practicing the trumpet next door, they will likely agree. You describe water as wet, sunlight as bright, stone as solid, and nobody accuses you of wild speculation. Shared perception gives normality a social weight. It feels objective because it is collectively reinforced. But a shared simplification is still a simplification. Take light again, because it remains one of the cleanest examples of how much gets left out. The visible spectrum feels broad when you first learn about it in school. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. It arrives with all the confidence of a complete set. Yet that colourful ribbon is just a narrow range within a vast continuum of electromagnetic radiation. Human eyes happen to be tuned to wavelengths that proved useful under the conditions in which our ancestors lived. We evolved under sunlight, on a particular planet, with particular survival needs. So the range we call visible is not a cosmic centre, It is a local convenience. That distinction is easy to say, and strangely difficult to feel. You can know intellectually that infrared and ultraviolet exist, that radio waves pass through your walls, that microwaves, gamma rays and X-rays occupy the same broad physical family as visible light, and still continue living as though the eye's range were the natural boundary of the real. We do this all the time. Knowledge expands, but instinct stays provincial. The body keeps treating its own limits as though they were the edges of existence. Sound works the same way. Human hearing covers a decent range by everyday standards, but only a narrow band by physical standards. We do not hear all vibrations in air. We hear a selected portion and call it sound. Frequencies below that range become something else to us, perhaps a vague pressure, perhaps nothing at all. Frequencies above it vanish just as completely. A dog may react to something in the room and seem mysterious when, in truth, it is simply living inside a wider acoustic world. A building may tremble slightly with distant low-frequency vibrations and you remain unaware. A whale can communicate across enormous distances through forms of sound your ordinary experience never includes. Reality is busy. Human awareness checks in for one small segment of the shift. The same narrowing happens not only between species, but inside your own daily life. There are details your senses are technically capable of detecting that your conscious mind discards anyway. If you put on clothing in the morning, you can usually feel it for a few seconds or minutes. Then, unless something pinches or scratches, the sensation fades from awareness. The fabric is still pressing against your skin, but the brain decides it is no longer worth reporting. Your nose does something similar with smell. Enter a room with a distinct odour and you notice it immediately. Stay there long enough and the smell seems to disappear. It has not gone anywhere. You have, or rather, your attention has. The sensory information continues, but it no longer earns space in consciousness. This is one of the quiet miracles of being alive. Your brain does not simply receive input, it ranks it. It judges novelty. It tracks change more readily than constancy. The result is that stable aspects of the world become strangely invisible, even when they are physically present every second. Pressure, smell, low mechanical hums, the feeling of your tongue in your mouth, the exact position of your nose within your visual field. Yes, your nose is almost always visible if you try to notice it, sitting there with admirable loyalty in the foreground of your face, and yet most of the time your brain kindly edits it out. Imagine trying to hold a thoughtful conversation while being constantly reminded that your own nose is occupying valuable visual real estate. Evolution, to its credit, decided we had enough problems. The brain's devotion to change over constancy is useful, but it comes at a price. We notice the sudden movement in the grass, the unexpected sound in the hallway, the flicker that might indicate danger. We are less sensitive to the continuous background conditions of existence. That means the ordinary world is not perceived in full, it is skimmed, stabilized, reduced. The stable becomes invisible so the unusual can stand out. That is efficient if you're trying not to be eaten. It is less ideal if your goal is to understand reality in its entirety. And of course, even what does become conscious does not arrive unfiltered. The brain interprets sensation through expectation. It predicts what it is likely to encounter based on context, memory, and prior experience, then checks incoming information against those predictions. This is one reason the familiar can become almost impossibly familiar. The more often a pattern repeats, the less effort is spent inspecting it from scratch. A staircase in your home becomes something you barely see. You navigate it through a mixture of actual perception and reliable expectation. A street corner becomes a compressed memory. A favourite mug becomes not a detailed visual object, but a concept with a handle. This predictive way of experiencing the world is sometimes called predictive processing, though the label matters less than the simple truth behind it. The mind is not passively waiting for reality to introduce itself. It is actively guessing, constantly preparing a model of what is probably out there and updating that model when surprise forces the issue. Perception, in that sense, is partly controlled hallucination, corrected by sensory input. That phrase can sound more alarming than it needs to, but it captures something important. You're not seeing the world raw. You're seeing the brain's best current model of the world, adjusted by evidence. Which helps explain how normality hardens. What is normal is what your model predicts well. It is what requires the least revision. It is what the brain can process cheaply. A familiar kitchen is cheap. A face you know well is cheap. The route from your door to the shop is cheap. Cheap, in this sense, does not mean worthless. It means neurologically efficient. The cost of that efficiency is that the brain becomes resistant to noticing what falls outside the established frame. You can watch this happen in subtle ways. Rearranged furniture can feel surprisingly disorienting because the room no longer matches your internal map. A new haircut on someone you know might seem oddly difficult to read, not because it is objectively confusing, but because it interrupts a well-rehearsed prediction. Sometimes you can look directly at something and still fail to recognize it until the context changes. That brief lag, that moment of "what am I looking at?" reveals how much perception depends on fit. Recognition is not just about input. It is about whether the input matches a prepared category. Categories themselves are another form of slicing. They make thought possible, but they also hide variation. We call countless unique arrangements of matter by one word: chair. It does not matter whether it is metal, wood, plastic, ancient, modern, fragile, massive, ugly, elegant, inherited from a relative or rescued from a pavement at midnight, because you briefly convinced yourself this was a practical decision. Chair is the brain's compression format. It strips away detail and preserves function. Compression is useful. Without it, every object would arrive as a fresh puzzle. Yet compression also means that normal life is experienced through broad labels that blur the finer texture of what is really there. This is true not only of objects but of events. Rain, wind, traffic, conversation, birdsong, darkness, dawn. These are categories we use to smooth over immense complexity. Rain is never just rain. It is droplet size, temperature, wind patterns, airborne particles, electrical conditions, shifting light, sound against different surfaces, scent rising from soil, pressure changes, behavior changes in animals, surface tension, tiny impacts across 1,000 materials. But most of the time the brain says rain and moves on. Again, this is not a mistake. It is what lets you open an umbrella instead of composing a fluid dynamics thesis at the front door. The same economy governs your sense of time, which feels wonderfully relevant here because time itself often seems normal until you stare at it too long. Your direct experience of time is not a precise measurement of external reality. It expands and contracts according to attention, emotion, novelty, age, memory, and expectation. A dull meeting can feel like a geological era. An hour with a close friend can vanish before you have located your shoes. Childhood summers often seem enormous in retrospect, while adult years develop a slightly suspicious tendency to sprint. The clock is regular, your felt reality is not. Normal time is another edited construct, a practical approximation shaped by the brain's methods rather than a perfect mirror of the world. Space is no different. You do not perceive every dimension of the space around you equally. Central vision is sharp. Peripheral vision is broader, but less detailed. Distances are judged through cues, comparisons, motion, light, memory. Size is not simply given. It is inferred relative to context. This is why visual illusions can be so revealing. They do not merely trick us in a trivial sense. They expose the shortcuts perception uses all the time. Lines seem different lengths depending on surrounding arrows. Identical colours appear altered by neighbouring shades. Static images seem to move under certain patterns. The mind is not malfunctioning in these moments. It is doing what it always does, using rules that are usually helpful. An illusion becomes visible only when the rule is laid bare. And then there is attention, that precious and very limited resource that makes the small slice smaller still. At any given moment, vastly more information is available than you can consciously process. The brain solves this by selecting. But selection is exclusion by another name. To attend to one thing is to ignore 10,000 others. When you focus on a voice, other sounds recede. When you search for a face in a crowd, the architecture around you softens. When you worry, your inner world grows louder than your outer one. Attention is a spotlight, and a spotlight is defined not only by what it illuminates, but by what it leaves in the dark. Modern life complicates this further because it trains attention in unusual ways. Screens teach us to privilege fast change, clean framing, immediate relevance. Notifications reward interruption. Algorithms learn what holds the eye and feed more of it back. None of this changes the basic biology of perception, but it does shape the habits layered on top of it. The slice of reality we call normal is now often pre-sorted before it even reaches us. We enter environments curated for salience, frictionless design, emotional response. What you notice becomes not just a matter of biology, but also of technology and incentive. A species already inclined to perceive selectively has built an entire civilization devoted to selective emphasis. That may sound gloomy, but it is also clarifying. Normal has never been a neutral category. It is biological, cultural, historical, and personal all at once. What feels ordinary to one era is astonishing to another. Electric light would have looked supernatural to much of human history. Radio would have sounded like sorcery performed by well-dressed engineers. The idea that invisible signals fill the air carrying music, conversations, maps, arguments, recipes, and videos of raccoons attempting crimes against trash bins would have seemed difficult to defend in a village meeting. Yet now these things belong to normal life so completely that the real marvel is how quickly we stop marveling. That process is easy to miss because wonder has a short memory. A technology appears, expands the visible world, then fades into background. A discovery redraws reality, then gets folded into schoolbooks and casual conversation. Germ theory, planetary motion, microbes, DNA, electromagnetic fields, tectonic plates. What once shattered old assumptions eventually becomes ordinary enough to ignore. We inherit enlarged realities and call them common sense. There is something both impressive and slightly cheeky about this habit. Humanity repeatedly uncovers astonishing new layers of existence, and then, after a brief period of awe, starts acting as though they had always been obvious. Yet every expansion should leave behind the same lesson. If previous generations mistook a small slice for the whole, why assume we have finally escaped the pattern? Why suppose the portion we now call normal is complete enough to trust without question? It may be larger than before, yes. Better instrumented, better theorized, more carefully measured. But larger is not the same as total. Our current normal may one day look as quaint and incomplete as older versions do to us now. There is also the matter of emotion, which acts as its own filter over reality. Fear changes what stands out. So does desire. So does grief. A person waiting for medical news inhabits a different perceptual world from someone on holiday, even if both sit beneath the same sky. Anxiety can make every sound relevant. Love can make one face in a room seem brighter than all others. Sadness can flatten colour from a day that would otherwise seem warm. The external world may be unchanged in a narrow physical sense, but the lived slice of reality shifts with the state of the mind experiencing it. Normal is never purely sensory. It is also emotional. Memory plays a role as well because what feels normal is partly what feels repeated. The brain trusts the familiar not because it is always correct, but because familiarity lowers uncertainty. If you have walked one path 100 times, you can stop noticing most of it. Memory edits the present by telling you what can be ignored. That is one reason novelty feels so intense. Travel often seems vivid not because the world abroad is inherently more real than the world at home, but because prediction weakens and attention returns. You notice textures, sounds, distances, routines, scents, signs, weather, faces. The mind, deprived of its usual shortcuts, starts sampling more of reality again. Then given enough time, that new place also becomes normal. The slice shrinks once more. So normal is not a fixed window. It is more like a movable frame sliding over an enormous scene and convincing you the framed portion is sufficient. Most of the time that is fine, useful even. You do not need total perception to boil water, answer messages, or remember where you left the keys, though many of us remain impressively bad at that final task despite every evolutionary advantage. But once you understand that normal is a negotiated compromise rather than a complete picture, the everyday world changes character. It becomes less final, less sealed, less exhausted by what you happen to notice. And this is where the idea becomes more than a philosophical curiosity, because the limits of normal do not merely hide exotic scientific facts, they shape what you consider possible in the first place. If something lies outside ordinary sensation, outside familiar categories, outside the predictions the brain depends on, then you may not merely fail to detect it, you may fail to ask for it. You may fail to build the instrument, name the anomaly, design the experiment, or notice the pattern in the data because the frame of the normal has already told you what kinds of things belong in the world. That is a difficult thing to admit, partly because people enjoy the feeling that reality is mostly sorted out, and partly because the alternative makes the ordinary seem more uncertain than we would like. Not unsafe necessarily, just unfinished. The room remains a room, the road remains a road, the people you love remain real. But normality begins to look like a practical truce between a vast world and a limited organism. It is the reality you can work with, not the reality in full. And once you start living with that thought, even casually, it becomes easier to understand how whole layers of existence can go unnoticed for ages. Not hidden behind locked doors, not concealed in darkness, but simply left outside the frame. The world we call ordinary may be ordinary only because repetition has trained us to stop examining it, and because the machinery of perception is designed to deliver a manageable summary rather than an endless flood, which means the next step is not to run immediately toward grand mysteries, but to look more carefully at the machinery itself, at the quiet system inside your skull that decides what gets promoted into awareness and what remains, patiently and almost politely, beyond the edge of what you notice. And if that sounds slightly unfair, that your own mind might be quietly editing reality before you ever get a look at it, that is because it is unfair in the most ordinary and functional way imaginable. Your brain is not a museum curator devoted to preserving every detail of existence for your inspection. It is not a loyal camera, faithfully recording the full scene from edge to edge. It is not even a particularly honest narrator in the strictest sense. It is something far more practical and far more selective. It is a survival machine with a talent for storytelling, and what it shows you is not everything that is there, but everything it thinks you can afford to care about. That difference is easy to miss because consciousness arrives pre-assembled. You do not usually witness the edits. You do not sit in a control room somewhere behind your eyes, watching raw sensory footage come in while small neural clerks decide what stays and what gets thrown away. You receive the finished product, a coherent room, a stable face, a sound with a source, a sequence of events that seems smooth enough to trust. The work of construction happens underneath awareness. And because it happens underneath awareness, the result feels natural. It feels complete. It feels as though the world has been presented directly, when in fact it has been heavily processed before you ever knew it was available. This is one of the oddest things about being human. We depend on an internal model of reality that is so polished, so immediate, that we rarely notice it is a model at all. The brain takes fragments and builds a world. It takes incomplete signals and produces certainty. It takes ambiguity and turns it into objects, meanings, causes, priorities. And it does this so continuously, so efficiently, that you spend most of your life under the deeply understandable impression that you're simply perceiving things as they are. But you are not. Not in the fullest sense. You're seeing a controlled display, a version of reality filtered through biology, attention, memory, prediction, and usefulness. That does not make it false. It makes it selective. There is a great deal your brain never passes along. There is a great deal it simplifies before delivery. And there is a great deal it invents, not maliciously, but because invention is often cheaper than uncertainty. One of the clearest examples is vision, which feels like our most reliable sense and is in some ways a triumph of intelligent guesswork. It is worth remembering how little the eyes actually provide. Light enters, strikes the retina, and is converted into signals. Those signals are not tiny pictures. They are not miniature landscapes carried inward for inspection. They are patterns of neural activity that the brain must interpret. Even at this early stage, information is already being compressed and shaped. Edges matter, contrast matters, change matters. Huge portions of the scene are not treated equally because treating everything equally would be wildly inefficient. And then there is the fact that your visual field is not uniformly detailed. It only feels that way. The center of your vision, especially the tiny region where your gaze is focused, carries the highest resolution. The rest is much blurrier than you tend to realize. You can test this in all sorts of mildly humbling ways. Fix your eyes on one point and notice how little detail you can actually identify far from the center without moving your gaze. The world feels crisp across the whole field because your eyes are constantly moving and your brain is constantly stitching together an impression of completeness. But the completeness is constructed. You do not see everything sharply at once. You sample and assemble. In fact, you are blind in more places than you might care to admit. Each eye has a blind spot where the optic nerve exits the retina, a place with no light detecting cells at all. Under normal conditions, you do not notice it. The brain fills the gap using surrounding information, and the missing patch vanishes into a seamless whole. It does not announce its absence. There is no polite message in the corner of your vision saying, "Apologies, a section of reality is currently unavailable." The system simply patches the hole and moves on. That alone should make us more cautious about equating vividness with completeness. If the brain is willing to fabricate small regions of your visual world without asking permission, it is likely doing other quiet corrections as well. And of course it is. Color constancy, object recognition, depth perception, motion stability, all of these depend on active interpretation. The same pattern of light can be read differently depending on context. A shadow can make one surface appear darker and another lighter, even when they reflect the same amount of light. A face seen in poor conditions can still be identified because the brain is not waiting for perfect data. It uses expectation. It fills in likely details. It leans on memory. Most of the time, this is wonderfully effective. Occasionally, it makes fools of us in the supermarket when we wave at someone who is absolutely not the person we thought they were. That moment, brief though it is, reveals something important. Recognition is not purely passive. It is a fast, ambitious guess. The same principle extends beyond sight. Your hearing is also built on interpretation. Sound waves strike the ear, yes, but what you consciously hear depends on sorting, grouping, comparison, and context. In a crowded room, you can focus on one voice and let others blur into background. This is often called the cocktail party effect, a name that sounds rather glamorous for a brain function, mostly used to decipher one conversation while someone nearby laughs too loudly. Still, it tells us something profound. The ears take in a mixture of sound, but the mind reorganizes it into streams. It decides which pattern belongs to a voice, which to music, which to the clatter of dishes, which to danger, which to irrelevance. Without that sorting, experience would be a flood. And because the sorting is so effective, we forget it is happening. We imagine we're hearing the environment, when in fact we're hearing a selected and structured version of the environment. This is why unexpected words can leap out of background noise, why your own name can catch your attention across a room you were supposedly ignoring, and why sometimes you suddenly notice a sound that has apparently been going on for several minutes. The signal was there. Your auditory system had not yet promoted it to consciousness. It was in a sense below the threshold of concern. That phrase matters more than it first appears. Below the threshold of concern. So much of reality lives there. Your brain is constantly deciding what matters enough to become your experience. It does not present everything. It triages. Hunger becomes noticeable when it reaches a certain point. Pain escalates with priority. A repetitive background sensation fades. A new stimulus interrupts. A sudden movement in the corner of your vision receives urgent attention because movement may matter. The stable texture of a wall receives almost none because from an evolutionary perspective, walls are rarely dramatic. This triage system is why attention can feel so intimate and yet be so misleading. Whatever you attend to becomes temporarily your world. Whatever you ignore can almost cease to exist. There is something slightly unnerving about that. Not because it means reality disappears when you stop looking, but because your lived reality, the reality that actually occupies consciousness, is astonishingly narrow. Imagine all the information available around you right now. The temperature of the room, the pressure of the chair beneath you, the position of your feet, the faint sounds beyond the nearest wall, the movement of air, the feeling of fabric on skin, small muscle tensions in your neck, jaw, hands, 100 visual details at the edge of sight, internal sensations from organs you almost never think about. Most of it is absent from awareness until something directs attention toward it, and even then, attention is not simple. It is shaped by goals. Tell someone to look for red objects and they will find red objects more readily. Tell them to listen for a certain instrument and the music reorganizes itself around that cue. Tell them to expect danger and harmless ambiguities become suspicious. This makes perception surprisingly vulnerable to suggestion, not in the theatrical sense of mind control, but in the ordinary sense that what the brain expects influences what it notices. Once expectation enters the loop, the mind begins to bias reality toward what it is prepared to find. That is one reason fear can be so perceptually powerful. A worried mind does not merely think different thoughts, it experiences a different world. Shadows seem more meaningful. Sounds seem more urgent. Silences seem more loaded. The brain, primed for threat, adjusts its filters accordingly. It would rather produce a few false alarms than miss something important. From a survival standpoint, that makes sense. From a truth-seeking standpoint, it can be rather inconvenient. Anxiety in this way is not just emotion layered on top of perception. It changes the selection process itself. The reverse can happen too. Familiarity dulls inspection. Repetition lowers alertness. When nothing surprising is expected, the mind becomes economical. It stops checking certain things closely. This is why you can fail to notice major changes in scenes you know well, why people miss objects in plain sight, why routines make us effectively blind to parts of our surroundings. The brain is not being lazy exactly. It is making an informed decision that fresh analysis is unnecessary. The fact that this decision is sometimes wrong does not stop it from being useful most of the time, and then we arrive at memory, which many people imagine as a kind of internal archive but which behaves more like a reconstruction each time it is accessed. This matters because your brain is not only filtering the present, it is also editing the past. When you remember something, you are not pulling a perfectly preserved file from storage. You're rebuilding an event from traces, associations, expectations, and later information. Details shift, emphasis shifts, meaning shifts. Two people can live through the same afternoon, and later describe it in ways that sound as though they attended different realities. In a sense, they did. The brain selected differently then, and it reconstructs differently now. That should make us more modest about the confidence we place in the inner picture. The world you are shown in the moment is curated. The world you later remember is revised. The sense that consciousness is a transparent witness begins to look less secure. Transparent is not the right word at all. Consciousness is more like the front window of a complicated machine that has already made many decisions by the time the display lights up. Perhaps nowhere is this more obvious than in illusion. People often treat illusions as cute exceptions, little carnival tricks for the nervous system. But illusions are not exceptions in the deepest sense. They are demonstrations. They show the rules perception normally uses. A visual illusion works because the brain relies on shortcuts that are usually adaptive. It assumes light comes from above. It assumes certain depth cues imply certain distances. It assumes contrast helps define boundaries. When those assumptions are exploited, the result looks wrong only because the machinery has become visible. The illusion is not proof that perception occasionally fails. It is proof that perception is always constructed. There are even more striking cases where the brain does not just misinterpret input, but invents experience to preserve continuity. Consider phantom limb sensations, where people continue to feel a missing limb as if it were still present. Pain, pressure, position, even movement may be reported in a part of the body no longer there. That is not a simple error. It reveals how deeply the brain relies on internal models of the body. The body you feel from within is not identical to the body as it exists anatomically in every instant. It is an ongoing neural map, and maps can outlast the terrain. The same general principle appears in everyday bodily experience. You do not consciously monitor your heartbeat most of the time, even though it is quite literally central to your continued involvement in earthly affairs. You do not feel your liver negotiating with chemistry. You do not hear digestion like a formal report from management unless something becomes notably inconvenient. Internal reality is filtered just as ruthlessly as external reality. Interoception, the sensing of the body's internal state, varies enormously from person to person and moment to moment, and much of it remains below awareness. Your brain withholds not only the world outside, but much of the world inside. This selective silence is probably merciful. If every internal process were fully conscious, ordinary life would become intolerably crowded. Yet the silence reminds us of something easy to forget. Experience is a user interface. It is not the full system. What reaches awareness is the simplified version, the one designed for action rather than exhaustive understanding. The dashboard is not the engine room. That metaphor becomes even more useful when we think about prediction. Modern neuroscience increasingly suggests that the brain works not simply by receiving sensory signals and then reacting, but by constantly predicting what signals it expects and comparing the incoming data against those predictions. Much of perception may be the process of minimizing surprise. The brain generates a model, senses where reality deviates from it, and updates accordingly. If that is broadly true, then perception is less like photographing the world and more like controlled correction of an ongoing internal simulation. Again, that sounds more radical than it needs to. It does not mean you are floating in fantasy. It means the brain is efficient. Predicting is cheaper than rebuilding the world from scratch every millisecond. If you are walking through your home, your mind already knows roughly where the walls, doorways, furniture, and floor are. Incoming sensation confirms or challenges that model. When confirmation is strong, little attention is needed. When something deviates, perhaps a chair has been moved into your path by a household member with a mysterious disregard for your ankles, prediction fails and attention surges. This predictive style of perception has an obvious consequence. The brain is especially good at showing you what it expects to find. That is useful in a stable world. It is less useful when something subtle, unfamiliar, or category-defying is present. In such cases, the mind may not know what it is looking at. It may compress the anomaly into something ordinary. It may overlook it. It may literally fail to present it in a meaningful form. If something does not fit the model, consciousness may not receive it as a new and mysterious object. It may receive it as noise. That word returns again, and perhaps it deserves more respect. Noise is not merely meaningless disturbance. Sometimes noise is meaningful structure that the system is not yet prepared to decode. Throughout the history of science, signals have often begun as noise, tiny irregularities in data, background effects no one expected, patterns mistaken for error until better theory arrived. The same may be true at the level of perception. We imagine the world divides neatly into signal and noise, but often the difference lies in the sophistication of the observer. What one species ignores, another uses. What one century dismisses, another measures. What one brain throws away, another might, under different training or conditions, learn to notice. Training really matters here. Experts in many fields perceive things novices simply do not. A radiologist sees structures in an image that look like blur to most people. A musician hears harmonic relationships others miss. A tracker notices disturbances in soil and vegetation that are invisible to the untrained eye. A mechanic hears an engine and catches irregularities that, to everyone else, sound like perfectly normal machine grumbling. This is not magic. It is selective attention sharpened by experience. The information was there, but only some brains had learned to promote it from background to pattern. That should be encouraging. It means the limits of what the brain shows you are not entirely fixed. They can be extended, refined, retrained. But it also means that the ordinary version of experience is not the final version. What you notice depends partly on what you have learned how to notice. Whole layers of reality can remain invisible until the right concepts, language, and habits of attention make them legible. Even language itself influences perception in subtle ways. The words available to describe distinctions can make those distinctions easier to track. Categories help the brain stabilize patterns. Once you can name a thing, you can often notice it more readily. This does not mean language creates reality out of nothing, but it does help carve up the flow of experience into manageable units. A world without names would still exist, but it would be much harder to hold still in thought. Naming, in that sense, is another kind of filter. It reveals and reduces at once. So your brain is not showing you everything. It cannot. It was never meant to. It is showing you a workable slice, polished enough to guide action, compressed enough to save energy, continuous enough to feel trustworthy, and selective enough to keep you from being buried under your own sensory input. The great trick is that this partial display feels like a complete world. That is what makes it so persuasive. Not the volume of information, but the smoothness of the presentation. And once you accept that, even tentatively, the world begins to feel stranger in a very grounded way. Not stranger because it becomes supernatural, but stranger because it becomes larger than experience lets on. The room around you contains more than you perceive. Your own body contains processes you never witness. The scene before your eyes includes gaps your brain fills without consultation. The sounds you hear are selected from a broader field. The memories you trust are reconstructions. The certainty you feel is often the byproduct of successful compression, which brings us to a more uncomfortable possibility. If the mind already hides so much for ordinary reasons, for reasons of efficiency and survival and limited bandwidth, then the question is no longer whether reality exceeds perception. Of course it does. The more interesting question is how often the brain's filters cause the familiar itself to disappear. How many things remain unnoticed, not because they are faint or distant, but because they have been absorbed into routine so completely that the machinery of attention no longer bothers to report them. And that is where the plain, everyday world begins to look less empty than it seems. Less empty, and also less quiet, less colourless, less still. One of the easiest ways to understand the limits of human perception is to stop treating our senses as the standard by which reality ought to be arranged. We do this instinctively, of course. We speak as though the world comes naturally fitted for human eyes and ears, as though visibility and audibility are properties things possess in themselves, rather than the names we give to the narrow ranges our bodies happen to register. A thing is visible to us, so we call it visible. A thing lies outside that range, so we are tempted to call it invisible, as though the failure belongs to the thing rather than to the instrument. But the universe is not built around the settings of the human sensor package. There is no cosmic committee that decided reality should be optimized for a medium-sized primate with anxieties, language, and a suspicious attachment to coffee. Our senses emerge through evolution under particular conditions, and they are useful because they help us survive those conditions. That is all. The visible spectrum is not the full theatre of light. Human hearing is not the full territory of sound. The signals we notice are not the only signals present. They are simply the ones our species learn to use. That becomes easier to feel rather than merely understand in a dry textbook way when you start imagining how different the world must look and sound to other creatures. Not look and sound in the superficial sense, as though they are seeing the same finished scene through different sunglasses. Their worlds are often built from entirely different priorities, different channels of information, different forms of salience. What counts as obvious to one species may be completely absent to another. What we call background may be central. What we call empty may be crowded. What we call silent may be full of communication. Begin with colour, because colour is such a persuasive illusion of completeness. Humans tend to experience colour as one of the great givens of reality. The sky is blue, leaves are green, blood is red, sand is pale, night is dark. It feels clean, settled, factual. Yet colour as we experience it is the result of photoreceptor cells tuned to a small range of wavelengths, followed by a brain that interprets those signals according to context. That sentence sounds harmless enough until you realise how much of the world it quietly excludes. Visible light occupies only a thin slice of the electromagnetic spectrum. Beyond red lies infrared, and beyond violet lies ultraviolet, with vast domains of other wavelengths extending still further in both directions. These are not exotic decorations added at the edges of reality. They are part of the same physical spectrum, continuous with the light we see. The only reason they feel separate is that our eyes stop reporting beyond a narrow band. The world does not stop glowing outside human vision. We do. Many animals live with access to channels we lack. Bees, for example, can see ultraviolet light, which means flowers present themselves to bees in ways they never present themselves to us. To human eyes, a flower may appear attractively simple. A yellow bloom is yellow. A white petal is white. Lovely perhaps, but straightforward. To a bee, that same flower can contain landing guides, contrasting patterns, and visual markers invisible to us, almost like hidden runway lights built into the petals. What seems plain to us may be richly signposted to an animal with different receptors. The flower was never visually simple. It was only simple by human standards. Birds often inhabit a similarly expanded visual world. Many species can detect ultraviolet reflections in feathers and landscapes, which affects everything from mate selection to navigation. A bird may see distinctions in plumage that humans miss entirely. Two birds that look nearly identical to us may appear obviously different to each other. That should make us a little more cautious in our daily habit of calling things indistinguishable just because they are indistinguishable to us. It is a very confident way to describe the limits of one nervous system. Then there are creatures with even stranger adaptations. Some snakes can detect infrared radiation well enough to sense warm-bodied prey in darkness. In practical terms, that means a mouse moving at night is not just an outline or a sound, it is a heat pattern. It glows in a mode of perception we do not possess. The darkness that conceals it from human sight is not the same darkness to the snake. Darkness, then, is not a property of the world in some absolute sense. It is a condition relative to the perceiver. A space can be dark to one animal and full of information to another. and already the familiar world starts becoming difficult to trust in the old way. A garden at dusk is not one thing. It is many gardens layered over each other. The human garden, fading as visible light falls. The bee's garden, marked with ultraviolet structure. The snake's garden, alive with thermal traces. The moth's garden, organised around scent and nocturnal cues. The bat's garden, built from echoes rather than surfaces. The same physical place supports multiple realities of use and meaning, none of them complete, all of them selective. It is worth pausing there because this is not just a charming fact about animals. It is a direct challenge to the idea that what humans detect is the world in its proper form. When you realise that different sensory systems reveal different patterns in the same environment, normal perception begins to look provincial. Useful certainly, remarkable in many ways, but provincial. We are residents of one small perceptual district, not owners of the map. Sound expands the problem further. Human hearing spans roughly from about 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz, though in practice that upper range often declines with age, which is one of life's quieter indignities. Children can sometimes hear tones adults cannot. Teenagers may notice electronic squeals from devices that older people simply do not register. Entire slices of acoustic reality fade out over time, and many people never even realise they are gone. That alone is an unsettling thought. You can age out of access to parts of the world and remain mostly unaware that the world has become slightly narrower. Above human hearing lies ultrasound. Bats rely on it for echolocation, sending out high-frequency calls and reading the returning echoes to build detailed spatial information in darkness. To us, a bat's flight through the night may look uncannily precise, as though it has some mysterious gift. In truth, it is not mysterious at all. It is operating within a sensory mode unavailable to us. The night sky that seems visually sparse to a human observer is acoustically structured for the bat, full of surfaces, distances, gaps, insects, edges, and moving targets. What appears empty to us is almost certainly not empty to the animal navigating through it. Dolphins use similar principles in water, where sound travels efficiently and vision is often limited. Their world is shaped not only by what they see, but by what they can acoustically sense and infer. In some conditions, echolocation may provide information about an object's density, shape, distance, and internal structure, in ways our ordinary categories barely capture. Again, the lesson is not that these animals possess magical powers. It is that perception depends on equipment, and different equipment reveals different worlds. Below human hearing lies infrasound, low-frequency vibration that can travel long distances. Elephants are known to use infrasonic communication across kilometers. Some other animals may also detect these low rumbles, along with environmental vibrations generated by storms, geological events, or distant movement. To a human standing in a landscape, the atmosphere may seem calm and still. To an animal sensitive to infrasound, the same environment could be carrying warnings, social signals, or evidence of distant activity. Silence once again turns out to be a local interpretation. Even among humans, the world of sound is not merely what reaches the ears. It is what the brain manages to extract and organize from a continuous field of vibration. A city is a mass of engines, footsteps, ventilation systems, brakes, voices, construction, electrical hum, wind between surfaces, the shifting resonance of spaces, and countless other acoustic events. Most of it blends into a manageable impression because the mind collapses complexity into labels. Traffic, machinery, a crowd, rain. But what we call one sound is often a stack of many. The label is convenient, though the reality underneath is far more textured than the conscious summary suggests. Signals beyond human reach are not limited to light and sound either. Consider magnetism, one of those phenomena that feels almost embarrassingly ordinary once you learn about it in school, despite being exactly the sort of thing that ought to leave us all staring thoughtfully at walls. Earth has a magnetic field. Many animals appear able to sense it. using it as part of their navigation. Birds, sea turtles, salmon, and perhaps other species seem to carry some form of magnetoreception, though the precise biological mechanisms are still being studied and debated in different cases. The important point for our purposes is simple enough. There may be directional information built into the planet itself that humans do not consciously feel. Imagine what that means for a migrating bird. The world is not just landmarks, wind, light, and memory. It may also include a kind of planetary orientation signal, a directional layer folded into the environment at all times. A human can stand in a field and feel the sun, see the horizon, hear distant traffic, smell wet grass, perhaps look at a map with questionable confidence. A bird may be standing in that same field with access to an additional source of guidance we do not directly experience at all. The planet is saying more than we can hear. Smell, too, is one of the great reminders that reality is denser than human awareness suggests. Humans can detect many odours, certainly, but our olfactory world is modest compared with that of dogs and numerous other animals. We speak casually about scent as though it were a minor accessory to life. Nice for coffee, unfortunate on public transport, occasionally relevant to flowers. For a dog, scent is not decorative, it is structural. A dog moving through a city is reading layers of information most humans never notice. Time, identity, emotion, direction, health, territory, recent passage, biological residue. Pavement becomes archive, grass becomes correspondence, the air itself becomes a moving document. That phrase may sound slightly absurd until you remember how dependent our picture of reality is on the senses we happen to possess. If a species can reliably extract vast amounts of information from scent while we cannot, then our ordinary claim that a place is plain, ordinary, or uneventful starts to look rather weak. What seems blank may be dense with chemical traces. What seems fresh and clean may simply be legible to someone else in ways it is not to us. There are also electric signals. Some fish can detect electric fields, using them to find prey, navigate, or communicate. Sharks, rays, and certain other aquatic animals possess electroreception sensitive enough to register weak electrical signals generated by muscle contractions in other organisms. In murky water, hidden prey may still be detectable because bodies leak information in forms the predator can sense. The water, from our perspective, may look opaque and unhelpful. To such animals, it is threaded with cues. Once more, a seemingly hidden thing is not necessarily hidden in an absolute sense. It is only hidden relative to the observer. And then there are the countless human inventions that reveal signals no naked sense can detect. Radio receivers turn invisible electromagnetic fluctuations into sound. Infrared cameras translate heat into images. Ultraviolet imaging reveals patterns beyond vision. Geiger counters make radiation audible. Seismographs turn distant vibrations into readable traces. Microphones expose frequencies beyond ordinary hearing. Telescopes tuned to different wavelengths show entirely different versions of the sky. A galaxy seen in visible light is not the same as a galaxy seen in radio, X-ray, or infrared wavelengths. Each instrument draws out another layer, another structure, another set of processes that had always been there without asking us for acknowledgement. This is where the subject becomes especially humbling. We often talk about scientific instruments as though they extend perception, and they do, but they also expose how impoverished unassisted perception really is. The sky overhead is a perfect example. On a clear night, the unaided eye sees points of light. Beautiful, yes. Meaningful, perhaps. Ancient and emotionally effective, certainly. But point for point, that visible sky is only a fragment of what is there. Observe the same heavens through radio telescopes, and you find jets, remnants, vast diffuse structures, backgrounds, energetic events. Observe in infrared and coal dust clouds emerge. Observe in X-rays and violent regions blaze into view. One sky, many hidden architectures. We do something similar much closer to home. A thermal camera aimed at a room reveals heat leaks around windows, warm bodies, hidden pipes, electronics warming on standby, patterns of insulation, drafts and temperature boundaries no human eye can see. None of this is supernatural. It is simply more of the room than sight alone provides. A room, once you start measuring it properly, stops being a static box of furniture and becomes a field of flows. Heat moves, air circulates, signals bounce, microbes drift, particles settle, materials emit, absorb, reflect, resonate. The ordinary environment becomes busy in ways that everyday experience mostly edits out. And the editing is not merely a matter of limited receptors, it is also a matter of categorization. Even when signals are technically available, we may not know what to do with them. Anyone who has ever looked at a scientific image without training knows the feeling. A specialist sees structure, a novice sees noise. To an untrained eye, the screen may be almost offensively uncooperative, yet the information is there. Perception, once again, is not just about receiving input. It is about learning how to interpret patterns. What lies beyond human reach is not always physically unreachable. Sometimes it is conceptually unreachable until knowledge catches up. The history of science is full of such moments. Invisible worlds become visible not because reality changes, but because methods improve. The invention of the microscope did not populate water with tiny organisms. It merely revealed what had been swarming there all along. The development of radio detection did not fill the air with transmissions for the first time. It taught us how much invisible structure had already become part of human life. Medical imaging did not suddenly place anatomy inside the body. It gave us access to what flesh had been hiding in plain biological decency for millions of years. It is tempting, at this point, to treat the solution as simple. We cannot sense everything, so we build instruments. Problem solved. But that would be too neat. Instruments help, certainly. They expand the range of the detectable. They translate inaccessible signals into forms we can analyze. Yet they do not end the problem of selection. They only move it. Every instrument has limits. Every measurement highlights some properties and suppresses others. Every model depends on assumptions. Even the expanded world of science is still a world of chosen windows, chosen scales, chosen thresholds. We never reach total perception. We reach better approximations. Still, even better approximations change the emotional texture of reality. Once you know that every environment contains more light than you can see, more vibration than you can hear, more chemistry than you can smell, more orientation than you can feel, more structure than you can immediately recognize, the ordinary stops looking finished. The street outside is not just a street. It is a corridor of reflections, thermal contrasts, electromagnetic chatter, chemical trails, motion patterns, and hidden transmissions. Your own body is not just a body moving through space. It is emitting heat, carrying electric activity, interacting with fields, producing scent, exchanging particles with the environment, becoming legible in ways you do not experience directly. And there is something slightly comic in how serenely unaware we often remain. We stroll through rich, layered environments, acting as though what we notice is all that is worth noticing. The world, meanwhile, continues broadcasting in channels we never receive. The flower keeps displaying patterns for insects. The bird keeps orienting by cues we do not feel. The bat keeps mapping with sound we do not hear. The dog keeps reading stories on the wind. The fish keeps sensing electrical disturbances in dark water. The room keeps leaking heat and carrying signals through the air while we look for the remote control and declare the evening uneventful. What matters in all of this is not simply that other creatures can do impressive things. It is that reality itself is not obliged to arrive in human-friendly packaging. The categories of visible and invisible, audible and silent, present and absent, are far less solid than they first appear. Something can be physically here and not appear in our version of experience. Something can be active all around us and never become a conscious event. Something can structure an animal's entire world while remaining for us effectively non-existent. Once you become serious about that, even ordinary perception begins to feel like a negotiated compromise rather than an open window. We're not standing before reality in full daylight. We're standing in one narrow beam, calling the illuminated patch complete, because it is the patch we know how to live inside. Beyond it, not in some distant fantasy, but woven into the same places we already inhabit, are colours we do not see, sounds we do not hear, signals we do not register, and patterns that remain part of the world whether or not we ever learn how to notice them. Which is perhaps why the strangest things are often not hidden behind walls or buried underground, but resting comfortably in the most familiar settings, waiting not to appear exactly, but to be recognised. What makes the familiar so difficult to see is not that it hides itself especially well, but that the mind becomes economical around anything it believes it already understands. Once a thing has been sorted and named and folded into routine, it tends to slip out of conscious view. Not physically, of course. The chair remains in the corner, the clock remains on the wall, the same road still curves past the same buildings, and the same face still appears across the breakfast table. But mentally, something changes. The rich presence of the thing is reduced to a working summary. The brain no longer asks what is this, because it believes that question was answered long ago. And once that happens, the object, place, or pattern does not vanish from reality. It vanishes from inspection. This may be one of the most important and least appreciated facts about human perception. We often assume that the things we know best are the things we see most clearly. In everyday life, that sounds reasonable. Surely your own home, your own street, your own habits, your own face in the mirror ought to be among the most familiar, and therefore the most thoroughly understood parts of experience. Yet in many ways the opposite is true. The more often something is encountered, the more likely it is to be compressed. Familiarity lowers attention. Repetition breeds not contempt exactly, but perceptual thrift. You can feel this in the simplest possible situations. Walk into a room you use every day and try for a moment to see it as though you had never been there before. Not in a dramatic way, not as though you have arrived to investigate a crime or inherit a suspiciously specific Victorian estate, but plainly. Look at the walls, the surfaces, the distribution of objects, the minor signs of use, the patterns of light, the scuffs, the textures, the angles, the small asymmetries. It is surprisingly difficult to maintain that kind of attention. The brain keeps trying to pull the scene back into summary form. Desk, lamp, shelf, window, done. It wants to collapse the richness into categories as quickly as possible. The room is already known, and the known is expensive to inspect in detail when there are other things to monitor. This is why strange gaps can open in places we think we know intimately. People can live in the same house for years and then suddenly notice a detail they have somehow overlooked for months. A faint stain near a doorframe, a crack in a tile, a recurring shadow at a certain hour, a sound that has apparently always been there, but only just now becomes recognisable. There is a special kind of embarrassment attached to this discovery, because it seems to imply carelessness. How did I not notice that before? But the answer is often not simple carelessness. It is the normal operation of a brain that favours stability over exhaustive review. What is familiar becomes infrastructural. It turns into the unnoticed framework within which daily life unfolds. Your home is less a scene than a system of expectations. You do not see each step on the stairs, you trust them. You do not inspect the door handle, you reach for it. You do not evaluate the exact shape of your kettle each morning. You move through a routine that has already converted objects into functions. The world closest to you is often treated least like a world, and most like an extension of your own internal habits. This habit-based way of living is extremely useful. Without it, even simple mornings would become impossible marathons of analysis. Imagine having to freshly evaluate each spoon, sock, cupboard and hallway corner every day as though reality had just been invented overnight. Human life would grind to a halt under the weight of unnecessary astonishment. So the brain does what it must. It automates. It predicts. It allows action to outrun examination. Familiarity becomes a kind of permission not to look. The trouble is that permission can become blindness. Not medical blindness, not even inattention in the casual sense, but a more structural inability to register what has blended into the background model of the world. Psychologists have long studied forms of this, including change blindness, in which people fail to notice significant alterations in a scene when those changes occur during a brief interruption or distraction. A person in a video changes clothes, an object disappears from a table, a building feature shifts between images. The change can be large, obvious in retrospect, and still go unnoticed. This is not because the eyes are incapable. It is because the brain does not maintain a complete, high-resolution record of the world from one moment to the next. It carries a practical sketch, and if the sketch still seems adequate, change may slip through. That should make daily life seem more peculiar than it usually does. We move through environments with a confidence that suggests continuous monitoring, but what we often have instead is a working assumption of continuity. We trust that the room remains the room, that the street remains the street, that the people around us remain much as expected unless something strong enough interrupts the model. If the interruption is subtle, or occurs where attention is not currently aimed, it may not make it into awareness at all. One of the stranger consequences of this is that presence and noticeability can drift far apart. A thing may be physically obvious, and yet psychologically absent. A coat hanging on a chair can become part of the furniture. A book left on a windowsill can disappear into the visual grammar of the room. A sound repeating each night can go unrecognised, until one evening it happens to align with a slightly different state of attention, at which point it suddenly feels new even though it is not. The item was present. The mind had simply not been presenting it as a relevant event. This happens socially as well, and perhaps even more dramatically. People become familiar to us, and once they do, much of what is vivid about them is replaced by our internal model of who they are. We speak to a person we have known for years and often respond not to the full complexity before us, but to a compressed identity our mind can handle efficiently. Friend, parent, neighbour, colleague, reliable, difficult, funny, reserved. The labels are not always false, but they are narrow. They allow us to interact smoothly, yet they also cause us to overlook change, contradiction, and hidden depth. There is a sense in which even the people closest to us can disappear in plain sight, not because they are physically absent, but because familiarity can turn a person into a role inside our mental shorthand. That is one reason people are so often startled when someone they know behaves in an unexpected way. The surprise is not only about the action itself, it is about the revelation that we had stopped seeing the person as open-ended. We had replaced the living complexity with a manageable pattern, and that pattern seemed sufficient until it was broken. The familiar person had become mentally static, even while continuing to change in ways we did not register. Places undergo the same compression. Anyone who has travelled and then returned home knows the strange effect that sometimes occurs in the first day or two back. Streets once taken for granted suddenly look vivid again. Distances feel measurable. The local weather seems oddly textured. The architecture appears specific rather than generic. You may even notice the smell of your own town, something usually invisible to awareness because it is constant. Then, with discouraging speed, the freshness fades. The brain resumes its normal efficiencies. The place becomes background again. Home stops being a scene and returns to being the default condition through which other thoughts move. There is an important lesson buried in that shift. The world did not become more detailed while you were away, and then lose detail on your return. Your attention changed. The familiar is often not less rich than the unfamiliar. It is simply more compressed by expectation. Travel can feel mentally expansive, partly because it weakens the predictive grip of routine. The brain cannot rely as heavily on old shortcuts, so more of the environment remains consciously available. New streets are noticed, new sounds are sorted, new social cues are observed more carefully. Novelty temporarily reopens perception. Yet novelty is not the only way to see more. Disruption does it too. A power cut, for example, can expose how much of ordinary life had gone unexamined. Suddenly the hum of appliances stops, and you realise there had been a low electrical texture to the house all along. The darkness changes the room, and objects previously ignored acquire strange weight and shape. Without the usual lighting, the familiar becomes difficult to navigate, and that difficulty forces attention back into places it had long abandoned. A missing signal can reveal how saturated the background was with unnoticed structure. Illness does something similar, though in a less charming way. When the body stops functioning normally, internal sensations that were once invisible become impossible to ignore. Breathing, swallowing, muscle tension, temperature, balance, fatigue, the presence of one's own throat, which normally goes blissfully unremarked upon, can become overpoweringly real. Health is perhaps the most invisible form of familiarity. When it is intact, it withdraws from awareness. We do not spend much time in grateful contemplation of a painless knee or an untroubled stomach, though perhaps we should. The body disappears into function until function breaks. There is a broader pattern here. Familiar things disappear not because they are small or weak, but because constancy itself invites neglect. The brain is highly sensitive to difference, interruption, and movement. It is far less interested in what persists without demanding interpretation. This makes evolutionary sense. A creature that notices sudden change has an advantage. A creature that devotes equal attention to every stable background feature is going to have a difficult time avoiding danger, and also a very long day. But from the standpoint of understanding reality, this bias means the stable world may be the most invisible of all. Even language contributes to the vanishing act. Once something has a name, the name can stand in for perception. Tree, car, bird, building, neighbour, morning. We use the word and feel, quite reasonably, that we have captured the thing. Yet naming is a form of reduction. A tree becomes a tree instead of this particular branching structure. With this bark, these scars, these fungal relationships underground, this movement in wind, this angle toward light, this history of seasons, this specific arrangement of life and stress and growth. The name is useful. Without it, thought would become impossibly cluttered. But once the name arrives, direct attention often declines. The category does the seeing for us. That may be why artists, scientists, and careful observers of all kinds often describe a similar experience when they really look at familiar things. The ordinary becomes startlingly specific again. A painter studying a cup does not see cup in the ordinary shorthand sense. They see edge, shadow, reflection, colour shifts, proportion, texture, spatial relation. A biologist examining a patch of soil does not see dirt in the vague daily sense. They see structure, organisms, moisture, chemistry, roots, history. The thing has not changed. What changes is the collapse of summary. Detail floods back when the category loosens. Children sometimes inhabit this mode more naturally, at least for a time. The world is less fully named for them, less stabilised by long repetition, and so ordinary objects can hold attention with an intensity adults reserve for emergencies or expensive electronics. A puddle can be endlessly interesting. So can a key, a bug, a spoon, a crack in the pavement, a patch of light on a wall. Adults watching this may feel amused, slightly impatient, or briefly reminded that there was once a stage of life in which the world had not yet become compressed into utility. Childhood is not a state of perfect perception, of course. It comes with its own confusions and limitations, but it does reveal how much ordinary adult experience depends on skipping over what seems settled. That skipping over can affect not just things and people, but ideas. The most powerful assumptions in a culture are often the ones nobody inspects because they feel too obvious to mention. Common sense, by definition, does not announce itself as a theory. It presents itself as the flaw beneath thought. This is why major intellectual shifts can be so disorienting. They reveal that the most familiar explanations were never neutral facts of nature, but human simplifications that had become invisible through repetition. Once again, the familiar disappears not by leaving the scene, but by becoming the unquestioned frame of the scene. And there is something quietly unsettling about how often we mistake this disappearance for completeness. We assume that because something feels obvious, it has been fully understood. But obviousness is often just a symptom of compression. The thing has been made mentally cheap. That is not the same as being mentally exhausted. A street lamp can be obvious and still contain layers of design, infrastructure, material science, economics, labour history, electrical flow, social meaning, and patterns of insect behaviour that barely enter ordinary awareness. A loaf of bread can be obvious and still represent agriculture, trade, microbiology, chemistry, weather, cultural habits, and centuries of human technique. The familiar object is rarely simple. It is merely efficiently ignored. This is part of what makes the idea of something hidden in plain sight so compelling. We tend to imagine hidden things as rare intrusions into the normal world, but hiddenness may be produced by normality itself. Anything that persists quietly, blends into expectation, lacks a category, or arrives without novelty is at risk of being mentally erased. The hidden may not be behind the curtain. It may be woven into the curtain fabric so thoroughly that nobody thinks to examine it. There is a good reason many discoveries begin with someone noticing what others had treated as background. Mould in a petri dish, anomalies in orbital motion, tiny irregularities in experimental results, repeated patient complaints that did not fit prevailing categories, a pattern in the stars, a faint signal in data. So often, the first step is not finding something dramatically concealed, but refusing to dismiss what everyone else had learned to overlook. Attention, in that sense, is not just a mental spotlight. It is a way of resisting premature familiarity. At the same time, no one can live in a permanent state of fresh astonishment. That would be unbearable, and probably not especially productive. The goal is not to destroy familiarity, but to understand its cost. Familiarity gives us fluency. It lets life move. It lets us function without constant cognitive overload. Yet it also edits. It hides by smoothing. It removes the grain of the real so that action can proceed efficiently. The question is not whether we should abandon that process. We cannot. The question is how much of the world vanishes because we trust it too completely. Perhaps the most striking example is your own face. You have seen it thousands of times in mirrors, windows, photographs, video calls, tired bathroom lighting, better lighting carefully selected for strategic reasons, and still it is probably one of the least directly known things in your life. You recognize it instantly, yes, but recognition is not the same as perception. Most people carry around a strangely simplified sense of how they look. Photographs can seem wrong. Recordings of the voice can seem alien. Not because the evidence is false, but because your internal model is economical, familiar, and incomplete. Even the self disappears in plain sight once repetition has worn the details down into a concept. All of this suggests something almost backwards about the human relationship to reality. We do not necessarily overlook the rarest things. Sometimes we overlook the steadiest things. We do not always miss what is hidden far away. We miss what is folded into the scene so thoroughly that inspection feels unnecessary. We do not fail to notice only the extraordinary. We fail to notice the ordinary once it stops making demands. That may be why moments of genuine attention can feel oddly emotional. To really notice a familiar place, a familiar person, a habitual action, even a familiar silence, is to recover some part of the world from conceptual sleep. The object has not returned exactly because it never left. What returns is your contact with its specificity, and that recovery can feel almost like waking up inside a life you'd been moving through on partial display, which raises an interesting problem for everything we have been considering so far. If ordinary perception is so eager to compress the familiar, if the constant is what most easily fades from conscious inspection, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What kinds of patterns survive by becoming routine? What kinds of structures pass unnoticed because they are not rare enough to alarm us, not dramatic enough to interrupt us, and not named well enough to stand out? Somewhere between novelty and invisibility, between background and recognition, lies a very large territory of experience that most of us cross every day without properly seeing. And it is in that territory that the everyday world begins to reveal just how much can remain present without ever fully arriving in the mind. And that territory is not empty. It is structured in ways we rarely stop to examine, full of repeated arrangements, rhythms, regularities, and subtle connections that shape daily life, without ever quite presenting themselves as events. Most people think of patterns as things that become visible only when you step into science, mathematics, design, or data. A pattern sounds formal, something charted on a graph, or described in a lecture by a person with very organised handwriting. But everyday life is already saturated with patterns long before anyone measures them. The strange part is not that the patterns exist. The strange part is how often they disappear into normality so completely that they no longer feel like patterns at all. Take the simple matter of walking through a city. To conscious awareness, the experience often feels improvised. You leave your home, turn a corner, wait at a crossing, pass other people, hear traffic, notice a dog, avoid someone reading their phone with the confidence of a person who believes pavements are theoretical. It all seems casual and immediate, a flow of little present tense decisions. Yet beneath that casual feeling lies a dense structure of repeated habits and invisible coordination. There are patterns in how crowds move, in how people negotiate shared space without speaking, in which side of a path they instinctively favour, in how bodies adjust speed when approaching bottlenecks, in how shop windows capture attention, in how noise changes the pace of walking, in how weather alters routes and posture and mood. None of this is random. It is not always conscious either. The pattern exists whether or not anyone describes it. That is one of the reasons public spaces can feel strangely different from one city to another, even before you can explain why. A place has rhythms, it has timing, it has flows of light, speech, silence, impatience, distance, eye contact, hesitation, momentum. Some streets encourage lingering, others encourage passage. Some train stations generate a particular kind of hurried intelligence, a form of social navigation so efficient it can seem almost collective. You learn how to move within these structures without necessarily noticing that you are learning them. The invisible pattern becomes part of your body's routine. You begin to participate in an order that remains largely unnamed. Homes have their own patterns, quieter but no less powerful. The arrangement of furniture influences movement. The position of light affects where people pause. The sounds of a building establish an unnoticed schedule. Floorboards signal footsteps, pipes announce showers, doors open and close with familiar timing. In many households, people develop an extraordinary unconscious sensitivity to one another's routines. You can tell who is awake from the sequence of sounds. You can identify someone by the force of a step or the way a cupboard closes. You know, without meaning to know, when the house is behaving normally and when something is slightly off. A familiar place becomes legible through repetition, not because you have formally studied it, but because the brain has been recording patterns below the level of deliberate analysis. This is true even when we call a place quiet. Quiet does not mean empty, It means consistent enough that the variations no longer ask for attention. The hum of a refrigerator, the distant wash of traffic, the occasional settling of the building, the faint movement of air through vents or window cracks, the irregular taps that come with heating systems or cooling pipes. These sounds often disappear into the general idea of silence. Yet if one of them stops, or one new sound enters, it can feel immediately strange. The discomfort comes from a broken pattern, though we rarely name it that way. We simply say something feels different. There is a great deal hidden inside that phrase. Something feels different. It often means the brain has detected a shift before consciousness has identified the source. A room may seem odd because the lighting balance has changed, because an expected background sound is absent, because an object has moved slightly, because the timing of activity no longer matches the usual sequence. You may not know the cause at first. You only know that the invisible pattern has been disturbed. This happens in conversations too. A person sounds normal, but somehow not normal. A pause lasts half a second too long. The emphasis lands strangely. A familiar phrase is omitted. Long before you can explain what is wrong, you have already registered deviation. Humans are far more sensitive to these buried regularities than we often realize. We are pattern-detecting creatures to an almost absurd degree. We cannot help it. It is one of our defining talents and one of our recurring problems. We detect patterns in weather, in faces, in tone of voice, in market trends, in social behavior, in music, in chance events, in the arrangement of stars, and occasionally in things that are not patterns at all. That last point matters because the same machinery that allows us to discover meaningful structure can also lead us into superstition, false connections, and highly confident nonsense. Still, the existence of error does not erase the basic truth. Much of life is navigated not by explicit reasoning, but by the detection of regularities so familiar they feel like atmosphere. Music is one of the clearest examples because it lets the hidden become audible. A melody works only because the brain tracks pattern. Rhythm works because repetition creates expectation. Harmony works because relations between sounds establish tension and release. Even surprise in music depends on a prior structure being sensed. A note feels unexpected because the brain has already built a forecast of what might come next. Without pattern, there is no meaningful departure from pattern. Yet what is striking is that most listeners do not experience themselves as performing complex predictive analysis. They simply hear music. The pattern is absorbed into experience so smoothly that it feels immediate. Prediction and recognition become pleasure, suspense, movement, emotion. Language behaves in a similar way. Every sentence you understand depends on enormous layers of learned structure. Sounds must be grouped into words. Words must fall into expected relations. Intonation must guide meaning. Context must eliminate alternate possibilities. Cultural conventions must fill gaps. The system is astonishingly complex, but fluent speakers do not feel that complexity most of the time. They live inside it. They anticipate sentence shapes without noticing. They detect odd phrasing instantly, even if they cannot always explain the rule being violated. Grammar, tone, politeness, sarcasm, emphasis, regional rhythm, all of it forms a patterned world so constant and practiced that it becomes almost transparent. That transparency can make ordinary communication seem simpler than it is. In reality, every conversation is full of hidden structure. There are timing patterns in turn-taking, small pauses that signal one thing in one setting and another elsewhere, facial micro-adjustments, gaze shifts, breathing cues, familiar openings, familiar closings, expected levels of directness, implied meanings carried by words left unsaid. Social life is one of the richest patterned environments humans inhabit, and much of it remains invisible precisely because we have become so skilled at moving through it. We do not usually think, now I will interpret the 4 overlapping signals in that half second of silence. We just do it. Daily routines too are structured by patterns that vanish into their own success. Morning habits may feel personal and spontaneous, but they often run with striking regularity. The sequence of movement after waking, the route through a kitchen, the objects touched first, the places where attention stalls, the tempo of dressing, the order of checking messages, the timing of caffeine, the path out the door. Small patterns become embodied. They settle into muscle memory and expectation. Then, if something interrupts them, the disruption feels larger than it objectively is. A missing mug, a moved charger, a broken lamp, an unexpected message before breakfast, and suddenly the day feels unsettled. A tiny broken sequence can make reality itself seem slightly misaligned. This suggests something important about perception. We do not just inhabit a world of objects, we inhabit a world of recurring arrangements in time. The pattern is often not in the thing alone, but in the sequence. A hallway at night carries one mood because it is linked to usual nighttime conditions. A certain ringtone means something because it arrives in a recurring framework of communication and expectation. Even smell can function this way. The scent of soap in a hallway, rain on warm pavement, coffee at a particular hour, old books in a certain kind of room. These are not just sensory details, they are parts of patterned environments. They belong to regular bundles of meaning learned over time. The body itself is deeply patterned, though much of that pattern never reaches awareness unless something goes wrong. Breathing follows rhythms. Sleep cycles rise and fall. Hormones shift across hours and days. Attention has its own tides. Energy is not evenly distributed through time, no matter how firmly modern schedules pretend otherwise. Appetite, alertness, body temperature, mood, digestion, all of these move in cycles. Much of what people call personality or productivity is partly a story of patterned physiology interacting with patterned demands. You may think you're simply better at certain tasks in the morning or less patient in the late afternoon. Often there is a quiet biological pattern underneath, repeating with enough regularity to shape life while still staying mostly beneath casual awareness. And then there are the patterns built by the wider environment. Light changes over the course of a day, and with it attention, mood, and perception. Seasons alter not only temperature but social behaviour, sleep, movement, appetite, soundscapes, available colours, smells, clothing textures, time spent indoors, the angle from which daily places are seen. Rain changes traffic, speech volume, posture, memory and route choice. Heat changes tempers and sleep. Wind alters how streets sound. The environment is never just background. It is constantly reorganizing the conditions under which thought and behavior occur. Because these changes are often gradual or cyclical, they are easy to absorb without reflection. Yet they are patterns shaping experience all the same. The digital world adds another layer, one many people now inhabit so continuously that it has started to seem natural in the same way weather does. But digital life is saturated with hidden patterns. The order in which content appears, the timing of notifications, the rhythm of scrolling, the reinforcement of certain topics, the subtle encouragement of return behaviour, the clustering of emotional triggers, the repetition of visual formats, the design of interfaces that reward immediate action over lingering thought. None of this is neutral. It structures attention. It creates habits. It influences what feels common, urgent or true simply by controlling what repeats. A thing seen many times begins to feel familiar, and the familiar begins to feel real in a stronger sense, regardless of whether it deserves that confidence. This should probably make us more skeptical of our sense of what everyone is talking about, or what seems to be happening everywhere. Repetition has enormous perceptual power. It can turn anomalies into atmosphere. It can make selected patterns feel like the natural texture of reality. A person who repeatedly encounters the same kind of story, tone, or argument begins to live inside a narrowed field of expectation. Soon, the pattern disappears into common sense. What once would have felt curated starts to feel simply true. The invisible structure becomes invisible precisely because it has worked. But not all hidden patterns come from large systems. Some of the most interesting ones come from tiny, ordinary repetitions that shape our sense of place and self. Think about the objects you reach for without looking. The precise locations where keys are dropped, bags are placed, shoes are removed, books are abandoned with admirable faith that one day they will return to a shelf. These behaviours leave traces. They create visible and invisible arrangements in a home. A room becomes not only a room, but a map of repeated acts. Even clutter follows patterns. It accumulates in favoured zones, around transitions, near decisions postponed just long enough to become lifestyle. Memory depends heavily on such arrangements. You do not always remember where something is because you formed an explicit record. Often you remember because the object belongs to a pattern. The mug tends to be there. The notebook is usually here. The umbrella lives near the door. When the pattern holds, retrieval feels effortless. When it breaks, you're not only missing the object, you're missing the structure that helped the mind locate it. This is why disorder can feel cognitively expensive. It is not just visually busy, it disrupts expectation. The brain suddenly has to search more widely because the invisible map no longer fits the scene. The natural world offers endless examples too, though familiarity often makes them seem decorative rather than structural. Tree branches distribute according to repeated growth rules. Leaves arrange themselves to catch light efficiently. Birdsong follows species-specific patterns. Insects gather around certain light sources with suspicious commitment. Waves organize sand into ripples. Fungi spread through networks beneath soil. Clouds form along fluid dynamics most people never notice, unless they happen to like weather enough to point at the sky and say things that alarm their companions. Even what we call randomness in nature often contains constraints, distributions, tendencies, repeated forms. Once you know how to look, the ordinary outdoors begins to seem less like a loose collection of things and more like a field of recurring solutions. There is something almost comical in how often humans live among these patterns, while behaving as though the world is mostly made of isolated objects. Perhaps isolated objects are easier for language. They fit neatly into sentences. But reality, especially everyday reality, is often more about relation than thinghood. It is about how events cluster, how features repeat, how timing aligns, how one behaviour produces conditions for another, how structures persist through change. A kettle, a window, a road, a voice, a tree, a phone screen, a season. None of these are fully understood in isolation. Each belongs to larger dynamics. Each sits inside patterns so ordinary they almost vanish from thought. That vanishing becomes especially interesting when a pattern is present but not yet consciously recognised. People often sense things before they can state them. A workplace feels tense before anyone names the pattern in communication. A friendship feels changed before the reasons become clear. A neighbourhood seems different before one notices the altered timing of shops, the new traffic, the shifting soundscape, the absence of certain faces. Conscious explanation usually arrives late. First comes a vague recognition that the atmosphere has changed. The mind is detecting structure before language catches up. This gap between detection and explanation can make the world feel mysterious in a grounded way. Not supernatural, not theatrical, just denser than conscious thought likes to admit. Your life is full of repeated forms you did not invent and often do not notice. You're guided by them, calmed by them, irritated by them, disoriented when they fail, and yet you may never bring them fully into view. The familiar world works partly because it is patterned. The mind works partly because it learns those patterns, but once the learning becomes automatic, the pattern itself sinks below awareness, leaving behind only a feeling of normality. That feeling is powerful because it disguises structure as plain fact. It makes recurring design look natural, social conventions look inevitable, personal habits look like personality, environmental cycles look like backdrop, and carefully engineered systems look like common life. The invisible pattern does not need to be secret. It only needs to be stable enough, repeated enough, and well-fitted enough to the brain's expectations that it no longer feels like a thing in need of attention. And that may be the most revealing point of all. We're often taught to imagine hidden truths as rare exceptions buried underneath everyday experience, but some of the most consequential hidden things are not rare at all. They are everywhere. They are built into the way light enters a room at a certain hour, the way your body anticipates familiar routines, the way a street organizes movement, the way language guides interpretation, the way technology shapes attention, the way relationships develop unnoticed rhythms, the way memory leans on repetition, the way the environment keeps whispering in cycles and flows rather than isolated events. Hiddenness in these cases is not the result of concealment. It is the result of successful integration. Once you begin to notice that, even slightly, the ordinary day becomes less flat. Repetition no longer means sameness. It means structure. The walk to the shop, the quiet of a room, the feel of a familiar conversation, the timing of hunger, the pull of a device, the atmosphere of a street, the small habits that guide your hands without permission. All of them start to look like visible surfaces resting on deeper arrangements. And if so much of life is already shaped by patterns we participate in without seeing clearly, then it becomes easier to understand how the mind can go one step further still, not only missing what is present, but actively completing what is absent, building coherence where the data is partial, and quietly turning uncertainty into experience before we have any chance to notice the construction. The mind does not merely leave things out. That would be simpler and in some ways easier to trust. A mind that only omitted information would be like a careful editor with a harsh word count, removing details for the sake of clarity, but at least resisting the urge to embellish. Human perception is not so restrained. It is more ambitious than that. When the information arriving from the senses is incomplete, uncertain, ambiguous, or simply too sparse to form a stable picture, the brain often does not stop and present you with a respectful notice saying, "Insufficient data, please wait." It steps in. It makes the best guess it can. It smooths edges, bridges gaps, builds continuity, invents coherence, and hands the result to consciousness as though it had been there all along. This is one of the strangest and most ordinary things about being alive. You're not just filtering reality, you're constantly completing it. The world as you experience it is not a raw delivery from the outside. It is a collaboration between incoming signals and the brain's expectations about what should be there. In many cases, that collaboration is astonishingly effective. So effective, in fact, that most people go through long stretches of life without noticing how much has been filled in on their behalf. The seams are hidden, the corrections are silent, the guessed at portions arrive with the same confidence as the measured ones. That confidence is what makes the process so interesting. If the invented parts glowed slightly, or arrived with a different texture, or came with a tiny footnote in the corner of your vision saying this section has been reconstructed for convenience, we would all be much more cautious about the reality we think we know. But the brain is not in the business of producing modest uncertainty where stable experience will do. It wants a world that can be acted upon. It wants continuity, legibility, usable scenes, reliable objects, plausible causes. It would rather supply a likely completion than leave you suspended in confusion every time sensory input gets patchy. Vision offers perhaps the clearest examples, partly because sight feels so immediate and authoritative. Consider how often your visual experience depends on information that is, in a literal sense, not fully present. The retina receives partial patterns of light. Some areas are sharp, others vague. Shadows obscure edges, objects overlap, lighting shifts. Saccadic eye movements interrupt and redirect. Yet the world does not appear patchy, unstable, and hesitant. It appears complete. The table has a full shape, even if part of it is hidden behind a chair. A person walking behind a fence is still perceived as one continuous person, not as a series of disconnected fragments appearing between slats. A car moving partly behind parked vehicles remains a car, not an unsettling ribbon of metallic pieces. The mind completes what occlusion conceals. This seems so natural that it hardly feels like an act of construction, but it is. The world often provides enough clues for the completion to be accurate, and because it is usually accurate, we forget it is also inferential. The brain sees a familiar set of edges, surfaces, movements, and relationships, then supplies the hidden continuation. It treats partial visibility as sufficient evidence for whole objects. Without that capacity, visual life would be hopelessly fragmented. Rooms would become fields of interrupted surfaces. Every crowded street would look like a broken puzzle of moving limbs and disconnected cloth. Continuity would have to be rebuilt consciously, and daily life would become exhausting in ways that are difficult to imagine. But the system does not stop at completing hidden parts of familiar objects. It also fills in missing patterns, where there may be very little information indeed. This is why we can recognize faces in absurdly minimal arrangements. 2 dots in a line can suddenly look like a face. A plug socket can seem vaguely expressive. A car front can appear annoyed. The moon can look calm, a rock face severe, a pattern in burnt toast unexpectedly informative to people who perhaps ought to get a bit more sleep. The tendency has a name, pareidolia, but naming it does not make it less revealing. The brain is primed to detect meaningful structure, especially faces, and when the data is suggestive enough it will complete the pattern. There is a good evolutionary reason for that bias. Missing a real face, a real expression, a real intention may have carried greater cost than occasionally seeing one where none existed. Better to jump at a false positive than fail to detect an actual person in the brush, an actual threat in the dark, an actual emotional cue in a social setting. The brain, in that sense, would rather be a little over-enthusiastic than embarrassingly late. Yet once you understand that, the implications reach far beyond funny examples and clouds. It means perception is tuned not just to what is there, but to what is likely enough to treat as there. That principle governs far more of experience than most people realize. Read a sentence with a missing letter, and your mind usually restores it without complaint. Hear a familiar phrase in a noisy room, and the brain may supply the unheard portions if the context strongly suggests them. In music, if a melody is briefly interrupted, the sense of continuity often remains. Speech perception in particular is full of such repair work. People can understand spoken language even when parts are masked by noise, clipped by bad reception, or distorted by accent, because the brain uses context, syntax, expectation, and timing to fill the holes. It does not wait for perfection. It predicts the shape of what should follow, and often experiences that predicted shape as though it had been fully heard. This is wonderfully helpful most of the time and occasionally the source of confusion. How often have you misheard someone only to feel absolute certainty for a second or two that you heard them correctly? They say one thing, the situation suggests another, and the mind races ahead to complete the probable sentence. The misunderstanding does not feel like guesswork, it feels like perception. Only later, when the context breaks, does the brain reluctantly revise the line. That brief certainty is the revealing part. It shows how quickly completion becomes conviction. The same happens in reading, where the brain is so skilled at pattern completion that people can skim badly printed text, recover words from partial shapes, and even glide past typographical errors without noticing them because the intended meaning has already been inferred. Experienced readers do not inspect every character with equal care. They use the overall structure of language to predict what is coming. That is why proofreading one's own writing can be strangely difficult. The brain sees what it meant to write and obligingly smooths over what is actually on the page. An omitted word, a doubled word, a clumsy phrase. these can vanish under the weight of expectation. The mind is, if nothing else, loyal to its own narrative, and narrative may be the heart of the matter. The brain likes coherent stories, not only in books and films, but in perception itself. It prefers events to have causes, movements to have continuations, expressions to have meanings, sounds to have sources, and sequences to make sense. When data are missing, the pressure toward coherence does not disappear, it intensifies. This is why ambiguous situations can feel so uncomfortable. A strange noise at night, a message that ends oddly, a look on someone's face that does not fit the conversation, a half-seen shape in poor light. The brain begins reaching for completions immediately. It tries to settle uncertainty into something actionable. In low light, this can lead to classic misperceptions. A coat on a chair becomes a person. A shadow near a doorway suggests motion. A branch scratching a window acquires intention. Again, this is not because the mind is irrational in some theatrical sense. It is because perception is predictive under uncertain conditions. When visibility is low, the ratio of top-down interpretation to bottom-up detail shifts. The brain leans more heavily on probability, memory, and concern. Fear can widen the range of plausible completions in precisely the wrong direction. A neutral shape becomes menacing because threat is one of the mind's favourite ways to explain incomplete information in the dark. This tendency is not limited to fear. Desire does something similar. If you want to hear your phone vibrate, you may feel it when it does not. If you're waiting for someone to arrive, you may interpret random street sounds as footsteps approaching. If you expect good news, ambiguous cues begin to tilt optimistically. If you dread a message, silence itself can acquire suspicious shape. The filling-in process is not emotionally neutral. It bends with expectation, and expectation bends with desire, fear, memory, and mood. One of the most revealing features of perception, then, is that the brain does not simply complete what is physically missing. It also completes what is socially, emotionally, and conceptually missing. Consider how quickly people infer motives from limited behaviour. A delayed reply becomes indifference, busyness, anger, forgetfulness, strategy, disrespect, uncertainty, any number of narratives depending on the observer's prior model of the relationship. A stranger's expression becomes friendliness or coldness, or distraction based on fragments. The mind despises explanatory gaps. It fills them with story. Often the story feels obvious. That feeling of obviousness is part of the danger. Memory, too, is heavily shaped by completion. Very few people store detailed, unbroken recordings of events. Instead, memory keeps fragments, themes, emotionally charged moments, salient details, and narrative structure. Later, when recalling an event, the mind rebuilds the experience. It fills in connective tissue. It assumes continuity. It inserts likely details consistent with what normally happens in such situations. This is one reason memories can feel vivid and still be wrong in specific ways. Vividness is not proof of accuracy. It is often proof that the reconstructed version has become smoothly integrated. That fact has enormous consequences. It means people can remember conversations that never happened in quite the way they describe, locations that were slightly different, sequences that have been reordered, emphasis that was added later, causes that make more sense now than they did then. The mind is not usually lying. It is doing with the past what it does with the present, building a coherent scene from incomplete evidence. Once again, the result is presented with the full authority of experience. It becomes even more interesting when groups share stories. A family anecdote retold many times can gradually shift, smoothing itself into a version that everyone accepts. A cultural memory can become stylized. A witness account can absorb other accounts. Repetition strengthens the completed version, not necessarily the original event. The brain prefers the tidy arc. Rough edges are worn away. What was once uncertain becomes fixed simply because the reconstruction has been practiced. The filled-in portions settle like concrete. This is not just about error, it is also about survival. A world that constantly arrived as disconnected fragments would be impossible to navigate. Completion is what lets you move smoothly through space, understand speech in noise, recognize loved ones from imperfect angles, infer hidden causes, and maintain stable concepts in the face of incomplete input. The problem is not that the brain completes. The problem is how rarely we remember that completion has occurred. We confuse the polished result with raw truth. There are laboratory demonstrations of this everywhere, though daily life does not really need the help. Visual illusions show that the brain can perceive contours where none physically exist, joining separate shapes into a coherent edge. Moving lights can create the experience of smooth motion, where only discrete positions are presented. Interrupted sounds can seem continuous if the mind infers that noise merely covered them. Faces can be recognized from astonishingly little information. These examples are often presented as curiosities, but they are really little windows into the default operation of perception. Your mind is always doing this sort of work. Illusions merely make the work visible. One of the most curious examples involves the so-called phonemic restoration effect, in which listeners hear a sentence with a piece obscured by a cough or burst of noise, and nonetheless report hearing the missing sound clearly. The brain uses the linguistic context to restore what it believes belongs there. That is a wonderfully practical skill, especially in the messy acoustic reality of human life, where speech is often interrupted by doors closing, traffic, laughter, bad microphones, and the determined chewing habits of people sitting too close to one's ear. But it also means that hearing is not simple reception. It is interpretation with active repair. The visual world contains similar acts of repair almost constantly. You see a face partly hidden by hair and still experience it as whole. You glance at a room and feel you have taken it in, though in reality only a fraction received detailed sampling. You watch someone pass behind a wall and assume continuity of person and motion. You look at a patterned surface and the brain organizes shapes into a stable object instead of a chaos of tiny marks. The mind's great triumph is to make these inferences feel effortless and therefore invisible. There is another layer though, one perhaps even more unsettling. Sometimes the brain fills in not only what is likely to be present, but what ought to be present according to the internal model it wants to preserve. This can happen in surprisingly mundane ways. If you strongly expect an object to be in its usual place, you may see it there in a casual glance and only realize moments later that the shelf is empty. If you expect a sentence to contain a familiar phrase, you may read it that way even when the wording differs. If you assume a person is standing where they normally stand, your attention may initially report the pattern rather than the current fact. Expectation can create a kind of perceptual momentum. Reality catches up later. This is one reason habits are both efficient and dangerous. They reduce cognitive effort, but they also encourage the brain to substitute prediction for inspection. On a familiar route, you may reach a destination with very little conscious memory of the journey, because much of the experience ran on expected patterns. Most of the time, that is harmless. Sometimes it means you miss a new sign, a changed landmark, a road closure, a subtle hazard. The known world is especially vulnerable to completion because the brain already has such a strong template for what belongs there. The social world is perhaps the most dramatic case of all. People do not merely perceive each other, they complete each other. They fill in motives, beliefs, intentions, emotional states, loyalties, future actions, all on the basis of partial signals. A familiar person becomes a predictive object. You think you know how they will respond. You think you know what their silence means, what their smile means, what their delay means, what their choices mean. Sometimes you're right, often you're partly right. Quite often you are simply inhabiting a completion generated by your own model of the person. The mind hates uncertainty in relationships because social uncertainty is costly, so it rushes to supply coherence. This explains a great deal of misunderstanding. Two people can experience the same exchange and leave with entirely different stories because each brain filled the gaps differently. One heard hesitation as indifference, another as caution. One saw directness as honesty, another as hostility. One interpreted silence as peace, another as withdrawal. The raw data were never complete enough to determine a single inevitable meaning. Perception supplied the rest. By the time reflection begins, the completed version already feels like reality. In that sense, much of human life is lived inside constructive perception. We are not merely receiving a shared world, we're constantly helping to build the world we think we're receiving. Culture deepens the process. Shared narratives teach us what kinds of completions are plausible. They teach us what counts as normal, threatening, admirable, suspicious, sacred, foolish, obvious. Two people from different backgrounds may complete the same ambiguous scene in very different ways because their brains have been trained on different priors, different social templates, different expected causes. Once you start noticing this, the idea of something hidden in plain sight takes on a more intimate form. Hiddenness is not always a failure to detect. Sometimes it is a failure caused by successful completion. The mind fills the gap so neatly that the gap itself disappears. You do not notice what was missing because the reconstruction feels complete. You do not investigate the anomaly because it has been folded into an ordinary explanation. You do not ask whether more is present because the model has already done what it was designed to do: stabilize the scene. This is why new knowledge can feel so disorienting when it arrives. Scientific discoveries, personal revelations, social awakenings, all of them often involve the collapse of a completion that once felt natural. You thought you understood the signal, the memory, the object, the person, the pattern. Then something small refuses to fit. The old completion weakens. Suddenly a whole region of experience looks different, not because the world changed in that moment, but because the mind can no longer sustain the same repair. Hidden structure rushes in where certainty used to sit. There is a useful humility in this. It does not require us to distrust all perception or retreat into total skepticism, which would be exhausting and also a dreadful way to buy groceries. It only asks that we remember how active the mind really is. The world we experience is partly found and partly made. The given and the guessed are more tangled than they appear. Confidence is not always a sign that nothing has been filled in. Sometimes it is the sign that the filling in has been especially smooth, and because the process is smooth, the most convincing inventions are often the smallest ones. The remembered word that was never spoken, the visual edge that is only implied, the motive attributed too quickly, the background sound mentally continued through interruption, the face seen in the arrangement of shadows, the object assumed present because it usually is, the harmless shape turned threatening by fear, the missing detail inserted from habit. None of these feel like grand acts of imagination. They feel like reality. That is precisely why they matter. The mind's willingness to complete what was never there is not a flaw bolted awkwardly onto an otherwise perfect system. It is part of the operating principle. It is how finite creatures manage an incomplete stream of information without freezing in uncertainty. But it also means that perception is never merely about what arrives. It is about what the brain contributes, repairs, predicts, and insists upon in order to keep experience continuous, which means that whenever we look at the world and feel certain that we are simply seeing what is there, we are almost certainly overlooking the quiet labour that made the scene feel whole in the first place, and that quiet labour becomes even harder to ignore once we begin comparing our small, repaired version of reality with the vastly different worlds inhabited by other creatures whose senses do not complete the same gaps in the same way at all. And once you begin to accept that the mind is always repairing the scene, filling gaps, smoothing uncertainty, and handing you a coherent world instead of a raw one, another possibility starts to feel less speculative and more obvious. Human perception is not simply limited in the abstract. It is local. It is one arrangement among many. We are not the neutral audience for reality in full. We are one species with one set of sensory tools, one style of brain, one history of needs, and one very specific way of converting the outside world into something usable. Which means that if you really want to understand how incomplete the human version of reality may be, one of the best things you can do is stop looking only at humans. Other creatures do not merely notice a few extra details around the edges of the same world we inhabit. In many cases, they live inside sensory arrangements so different from ours that it becomes hard to pretend we're all experiencing one obvious environment with a few minor adjustments. The physical setting may be shared, yes. The forest, the ocean, the field, the garden, the night sky, the room. But the meaningful reality extracted from those places can differ so profoundly that the same world starts to sound less like a straightforward statement and more like a polite simplification. A bee is a useful place to begin because it makes the point without much drama. To human eyes, many flowers seem decorative but fairly plain in their signalling. They are colourful, certainly, but the colours feel familiar and complete. A flower is yellow, white, blue, purple. We assume we have basically understood the visual invitation it offers. But bees can see ultraviolet light, and many flowers carry ultraviolet patterns that are invisible to us, while functioning as guidance cues for pollinators. In other words, a flower can be broadcasting instructions in plain view, and human beings, standing right beside it, remain unaware not because the signal is weak, but because our eyes are tuned to the wrong channel. That single example already changes the emotional shape of an ordinary garden. What seems simple to you may be visibly structured to something else. The petal that looks uniformly pale may, to the bee, contain contrast, direction, emphasis, maybe even the floral equivalent of a runway marking. It is not that the bee sees a magical hidden world layered on top of ours. It sees part of the actual world we do not. The pattern is there whether or not human eyes register it, and once that becomes clear, it is hard not to suspect that plain sight has always been a much narrower category than we like to imagine. The same kind of shift happens when you move from daylight into darkness. Human beings are deeply attached to vision and deeply inconvenienced by the limits of it. We like light because it restores our preferred form of certainty. But many animals are not nearly so dependent on visible light for building a stable world. Bats, for example, navigate and hunt by echolocation, emitting ultrasonic calls and interpreting the returning echoes. The space through which a bat moves at night is not simply dark in the human sense. It is acoustically contoured. Distance, surface, motion, opening, obstacle, prey, all of it can be read through reflected sound in a way that makes our own nighttime experience look comparatively clumsy. What matters here is not just that bats have a clever trick, it is that darkness itself turns out to be relative. The human night is not the bat's night. An environment that seems visually empty to us may be richly structured to an animal using sonar. This should probably make us less confident every time we describe a place as blank, silent, or unavailable. It may be unavailable to us, which is not the same thing at all. Snakes make the same point from another direction. Certain pit vipers can detect infrared radiation and use it to locate warm-bodied prey. A small animal moving through darkness can register not just as a shape, if visible at all, but as a thermal target. The snake is not relying on fantasy or instinct in some vague sense. It is operating with access to information human beings do not naturally possess. Even more striking, infrared cues can be integrated with visual ones in the snake's brain, producing a reality in which warmth itself becomes part of spatial awareness. Again, the lesson is not that animals have mystical abilities. It is that our own sense of what the environment contains has been calibrated by one very particular body plan. Once you keep going, the list becomes almost embarrassingly humbling. Elephants use very low-frequency calls, including infrasound, that can travel across long distances. To us, a landscape may seem quiet and open. To elephants, it may be carrying social information from far away, an acoustic thread connecting individuals beyond the range of human hearing. We think of communication as something mostly visible or audible in the ordinary sense, but other species can inhabit communication channels that pass through our own environments without ever entering awareness. A plain, still horizon may not be plain or still at all. It may be full of messages. Dogs, meanwhile, offer perhaps the clearest reminder that what we call a place is often just the small fraction of it we know how to read. Human beings move through cities and homes in a mostly visual way. We notice shape, movement, colour, layout, perhaps some sounds, and we treat smell as a secondary detail unless it becomes especially pleasant or especially unfortunate. For dogs, olfaction is central. Research on canine olfaction shows just how much information dogs can extract from scent, including present and past traces in their surroundings. A pavement, a doorway, a patch of grass, even air currents in a room can function as records of who has passed, what has changed, and what remains nearby. To a dog, a walk is not just a route through space. It is a dense chemical archive unfolding in time. That phrase matters because it helps explain why the human world can feel complete while being so obviously partial from another angle. We tend to think we live in space first and time second, moving visually through objects arranged around us. A dog in some sense moves through histories. Recent events remain present in odour. The environment keeps a memory we mostly do not perceive. Something has passed, and although it is gone for us in the practical sense, it is still there for another creature in a form that can be used. Marine life extends the lesson even further. Sharks and some other fish can detect weak electric fields using specialised sensory organs known as ampullae of Lorenzini. In water, where visibility may be limited and conditions may shift quickly, this opens an entirely different kind of awareness. Movement, muscle activity, the electrical traces of prey, orientation in murky surroundings, all of these can become accessible in ways human intuition barely anticipates. The water a diver or swimmer experiences as cloudy, dim, or uninformative may still be carrying valuable cues for an animal equipped to read them. Birds add another layer that is perhaps even harder to imagine from the inside. A substantial body of research supports the idea that many birds use Earth's magnetic field for orientation and navigation. However the precise mechanisms continue to be studied, the broad point is extraordinary enough. The planet itself may be legible to them in a way it is not legible to us. Human beings need compasses, maps, landmarks, screens, stars, and repeated reassurance. A migratory bird may be drawing on directional information folded into the geomagnetic field, information present all around us and yet absent from ordinary awareness. The Earth is not just beneath such animals, it is communicating with them. Once you begin gathering these examples together, a deeper pattern appears. Each creature does not simply add one new sensation to the human set. Each lives in a world organized around different priorities: a bee's flower, a bat's night, a viper's darkness, an elephant's horizon, a dog's street corner, a shark's water, a bird's sky. These are not minor variations on a single, neutral reality already complete in human terms. They are different extractions of the same physical surroundings, different usable worlds shaped by what each organism can detect and what each nervous system has learned to care about. This should probably affect the way we think about intelligence as well. Human beings often measure understanding by how closely another creature resembles our own style of awareness. If an animal does not think in language, build tools in our way, or attend to the same features we attend to, we are tempted to treat it as living in a reduced world. But very often the opposite is true. It may be living in a differently structured world, rich in dimensions we scarcely register. The reduction belongs not to the animal, but to our imagination. We keep trying to picture reality as though the human arrangement was central, when in practice it is just one strategy among many. there is something quietly destabilizing about that. It means the scene around you right now could support far more kinds of presence than your senses report. The room may contain thermal gradients obvious to another organism, sound frequencies unavailable to your hearing, scent traces you do not register, electrical signatures that mean nothing to you, reflected wavelengths you cannot see, spatial or directional information your nervous system never learned to read. You are not standing in a simple room, you're standing in one translation of a much larger field. The word translation is helpful here because it avoids two common mistakes. The first mistake is to imagine that reality is hopelessly unknowable, as though every creature is trapped in private hallucination and the world beyond perception dissolves entirely. The second is to imagine that one species, conveniently ours, has direct access to the official version, while all others merely inhabit specialized distortions. Neither picture is especially convincing. A better approach is to think of each organism as translating the world into a format that suits its survival. The translation is real, useful, and incomplete. No single translation exhausts the original. Human beings, to our credit, have invented tools that let us compare translations. That is one reason science matters so much in this discussion. We can build instruments that detect ultraviolet, infrared, ultrasound, electrical fields, magnetic effects, chemical traces, radiation, tiny vibrations and other signals beyond our unaided senses. We can learn, in a limited way, to inspect the worlds other organisms partially inhabit. But even here there is a humbling twist. Instruments do not remove us from the problem of perception. They only widen the set of translations available. A thermal camera gives you a human-readable version of heat. A detector gives you a human-readable version of electromagnetic activity. We are still converting. We are still relying on models, interfaces, and chosen scales. Even so, those expansions matter because they weaken a very persistent illusion. The illusion that what feels absent is absent. In ordinary life, absence often means only that human perception has failed to produce an experience. It does not necessarily mean the environment lacks structure, signal, or meaning. If another species can consistently use information you cannot detect, then the phrase "nothing there" becomes much less trustworthy. Nothing there for whom becomes the better question. This also helps explain why hiddenness can be so ordinary. We tend to imagine that to be hidden, a thing must be deliberately concealed, camouflaged, or locked away. But much of what remains hidden from humans is hidden simply by mismatch. The signal exists, but our receptors do not catch it. The pattern exists, but our brains do not privilege it. The information exists, but our kind of animal does not know how to live by it. Hiddenness, then, is often just a consequence of embodiment. Reality does not disappear. It waits outside the format. If you sit with that for a while, the ordinary world becomes much harder to flatten. A meadow is not just what a person sees in daylight. It is also a field of ultraviolet markings, scent corridors, vibrational clues, heat signatures, airborne chemicals, directional cues, and acoustic structures. The sea is not just blue water and reflected light. It is pressure, current, electrical leakage, low-frequency sound, chemical drift, magnetic orientation. A forest is not merely trees and shade. It is echo, smell, movement, polarized light, micro-vibrations, hidden paths of information that different creatures have evolved to read with very different fluency. And because we know this, because it is no longer speculation that other animals extract realities unavailable to us, the next thought becomes difficult to dismiss. If nature already offers this many examples of worlds layered through the same space, all of them real in the sense that they are built from genuine signals and structures, then human experience begins to look less like the final visible version of things and more like one modest sample, one animal's cut of the world, one familiar arrangement mistaken for long stretches of history as the arrangement. That is not a reason for despair. In some ways it is the opposite. It means the world is richer than the mind's first summary. It means that existence is not exhausted by what appears in human consciousness at a glance. It means that whenever we are tempted to say, "This is all there is," we should probably remember the bee and the flower, the bat and the night, the elephant and the horizon, the shark and the dim water, the bird and the planet's magnetic field, the dog and the chemical trail that feels to us like nothing at all. Once those realities are admitted, even as partial ones, the plain old human scene loses some of its authority, and the possibility that something could be here all along, not supernatural, not impossible, just persistently outside the narrow human slice, begins to sound less like fantasy and more like the most ordinary consequence of living inside only one way of seeing. And once you take seriously the idea that every creature inhabits only a slice of what is there, the next question stops sounding dramatic and starts sounding almost unavoidable. Could something be here all along, not hidden behind walls, not tucked into some unreachable corner of the universe, not waiting in a distant galaxy or at the bottom of an ocean trench, but here, woven into the same spaces we already occupy, present in a way that does not register because it never had to? That is the thought that lingers once the easier assumptions have been set aside. If our senses are limited, if the brain filters aggressively, if familiarity erases inspection, if pattern completion fills the gaps too confidently, and if other creatures plainly live in realities built from signals we do not detect, then the possibility no longer feels strange at all. The strange thing would be insisting that human awareness has already gathered everything important from the room. It helps at this point to be very clear about what kind of question this is. It is not a license to believe every eerie idea that drifts through the internet at 3 a.m. It is not proof that all mysteries deserve equal confidence. And it is not a polite excuse to replace careful thinking with vague gestures toward things science can't explain, a phrase that has done excellent work over the years for people who do not feel like explaining very much. The question is more grounded than that. It asks whether the history of perception, biology, and science gives us good reason to suspect that the ordinary environment may contain structures, processes, or kinds of information that remain outside the everyday human picture. On that point, the answer is not just maybe. It is almost certainly yes. The only uncertainty is which things, at what scale, in what form, and how far beyond present understanding they extend. Human history is full of examples where something was here all along and simply failed to appear in the accepted model of reality. Microbes existed before microscopes. Magnetism shaped the world long before anyone could describe field lines. Ultraviolet light touched petals and feathers and skin before humans learned to detect it. Radio waves crossed space before anybody built receivers to translate them. Neutrinos passed through matter in absurd numbers without leaving any direct impression on ordinary experience. Plate tectonics moved continents while generations argued about mountains and coastlines without seeing the deeper mechanism beneath them. In each case, the world was not withholding itself in a theatrical way. It was behaving as it always had. What changed was human access, human method, human willingness to suspect that the familiar picture was incomplete. That pattern matters because it keeps our imagination disciplined. The point is not that anything you can invent might be true. The point is that reality has repeatedly turned out to be richer than immediate perception suggested. Again and again, the missing layer was not missing from the world, it was missing from the human interface. This should encourage curiosity without encouraging nonsense, which is a balance people do not always maintain with great elegance. There is a mature version of wonder in which you accept that human awareness is partial, and that the unknown is likely to include things more subtle, more ordinary and more structurally embedded than ghost stories usually allow. Think about air for a moment, because it is perhaps the best example of how thoroughly presence can disappear through familiarity. To most people, in most moments, air is functionally nothing. It is the transparent interval between objects. the unremarked medium in which daily life takes place, interesting mainly when it is too hot, too cold, too windy, or carrying the smell of something recently burned in a pan. And yet air is full. It is pressure, motion, temperature gradients, moisture, particles, spores, chemical traces, pollen, microbes, sound, scent, dust, aerosols, turbulence, and constant exchange with every breathing organism in a shared environment. A room may look still while the air inside it remains in motion, carrying histories of recent presence. Someone passes through a space, and for a while afterward they are still there in ways that most human perception does not report. The same is true of light. A room does not contain simply illumination and shadow in the neat way it first appears. It contains reflections, absorbed wavelengths, scattered photons, invisible frequencies, heat signatures, polarization effects, subtle changes over time, and interactions with surfaces so ordinary that nobody thinks of them unless they happen to work in optics, or spend an unusually energetic afternoon trying to photograph a cat in a sunbeam. The visible scene feels complete because it is enough for ordinary navigation. That does not make it complete in any stronger sense. What is here is not exhausted by what the eye displays. Even the ground beneath us fits the same pattern. A patch of soil can seem like one of the simplest things in the world, the sort of substance people are happy to call dirt when they wish to imply that nothing intellectually respectable is happening there. Yet soil contains root systems, fungal networks, insects, microbes, gradients of moisture, chemical exchanges, buried seeds, decaying material, traces of past life, and tiny ongoing negotiations between living and non-living matter that support everything above. Much of the structure is invisible at ordinary scale. Much of the process is too slow, too small, or too conceptually distant to appear in daily awareness. And yet all of it is here, literally underfoot, participating in the existence of the scene we call normal. What makes the question especially interesting is that hiddenness may not require smallness or distance. We tend to assume that whatever escapes notice must be tiny, remote, or fast. That is often true, but not always. Some things go unseen because they're too stable rather than too subtle. Human attention is drawn toward novelty, change, contrast, and disruption. A constant feature can fade with shocking efficiency. This means that something widespread, persistent, and integrated into daily life could in principle remain unnoticed for a very long time if it did not fit existing categories or trigger the right kind of surprise. In fact, that is exactly how many major discoveries have worked. The clue was not vanishingly faint, it was simply not being interpreted. There is a useful lesson in that for how we imagine the unknown. People often picture hidden realities as dramatic add-ons to the world, new layers arriving with thunder, eerie music, and a sudden desire to narrate everything in whispers. But the more scientifically grounded version is usually less theatrical and more disorienting. The unknown may be ordinary in appearance, and revolutionary only in implication. A slight anomaly in data, a repeated effect dismissed as noise, a behaviour in animals that suggests an undetected signal, a pattern in disease transmission that points to invisible life, a subtle drift in the orbit of a planet, a spectral line, a background hum, something almost embarrassingly plain once you know how to look. That last part is important because it changes what being here all along really means. It does not have to mean some giant obvious object somehow escaping notice in the middle of the room like a poorly hidden elephant with excellent union representation. It can mean a process, a field, a flow, a relation, a mode of interaction, a class of signal, a property of space, a dimension of the environment that ordinary perception flattens into background. When people imagine the hidden, they often imagine things. But the world is not made only of things. It is made of structures, interactions, patterns, and dynamics, that may be much easier to overlook than any large physical object would be. This becomes easier to grasp if you think about the kinds of questions science tends to answer best. Many of the greatest discoveries were not about adding one more object to a list. They were about realizing that the behavior of familiar objects depended on deeper rules and hidden relationships. Electricity was not merely one more thing in the universe. It was a way familiar matter behaved. Germ theory did not introduce exotic monsters from nowhere. It revealed agents and mechanisms within familiar environments and familiar bodies. Relativity did not put a new planet in the sky. It changed the structure of space-time itself. Quantum theory did not uncover one extra particle and go home satisfied. It revealed that the small-scale behavior of matter refused to behave according to ordinary intuitions at all. This should make us cautious in a productive way. When we ask whether something could be here all along, the most plausible answer may not resemble the shape of our first guesses. The unknown does not need to arrive in humanly convenient form. It may not be an object that stands politely before the eye. It may be something that only becomes thinkable when instruments, mathematics, and new conceptual tools force the mind to reorganize what it thought the world was made of. In that sense, the greatest barrier may not be sensory limitation alone. It may be conceptual limitation, the set of categories we inherit, and the assumptions we stop noticing because they feel too basic to question. That conceptual side is easy to underestimate. Human beings do not just see through eyes and hear through ears. We also perceive through models. We have expectations about what kinds of things can exist, what counts as evidence, what deserves attention, what belongs in the background, and what a proper explanation ought to look like. Those expectations help us enormously. Without them, inquiry would become chaos. But they also limit what we notice. If a phenomenon fails to fit the expected categories, it may be ignored, misdescribed, or filed away under something more familiar until a better framework appears. In other words, a thing can be hidden not because the senses never register it, but because the mind does not yet know what kind of thing it is. This has happened often enough in the history of knowledge to become almost routine. There are always observations that precede understanding. People notice effects before they know the cause. They collect odd reports before a pattern becomes obvious. They watch animals behave in ways that do not make sense until later discoveries reveal what signal those animals were following. A clue can sit in plain sight for decades. Sometimes it sits for centuries. Not because humans are foolish in some simple way, but because understanding requires more than contact. It requires the right questions, and the right questions are often delayed by success. When a species survives reasonably well inside a simplified model of reality, it grows attached to that model. Why wouldn't it? It works. It keeps the furniture navigable and the predators mostly identifiable. The world presented by ordinary experience is coherent enough to build civilizations, raise families, plant crops, write books, and invent devices designed to distract us from the larger existential problem of having invented devices. Success creates confidence. Confidence hardens into common sense. Common sense becomes invisible. Then, when evidence starts to press against the model, people often resist not because they hate truth, but because the old picture has become structurally comfortable. That comfort is one reason the unknown tends to be rediscovered as normal. At first, a hidden layer of reality seems impossible or absurd. Then it seems surprising. Then it becomes accepted. Then children learn it in school. Then, after enough time, people speak of it, with the full boredom reserved for facts that no longer threaten the furniture of thought. This cycle is so common that it should leave us with a permanent suspicion that our present normality is also temporary. Not false, not worthless, but incomplete in ways future minds may consider obvious. There is also the question of scale. Human perception evolved at a very particular scale, one suited to middle-sized objects, moderate distances, familiar speeds, and practical bodily concerns. We are not naturally good at the extremely small, the extremely large, the very fast, the very slow, or the highly diffuse. Yet reality contains all of these. Plate tectonics is too slow for instinctive perception. Microbial life is too small. Cosmological structure is too vast. Molecular motion is too fine-grained. Climate trends are often too broad and gradual to feel like immediate experience, even when they have enormous consequences. A thing can be here, without being here in the tempo or scale that human awareness handles well. This alone opens large territories of potential hiddenness. Time, in fact, may be one of the greatest hiding places of all. Processes that unfold too slowly disappear into background just as effectively as those that are too subtle or too small. A forest changing over decades, a coastline moving over centuries, social norms shifting over generations, even a body aging day by day. The continuity of these changes makes them difficult to feel from within. Only comparison reveals what constancy concealed. Something can be present in plain sight and still escape notice if it acts on a timescale that exceeds the thresholds of everyday attention. The reverse is also true. Processes that are too fast may leave effects without leaving experience. There are events in physics, chemistry, and biology that occur so rapidly the conscious mind has no direct acquaintance with them at all. We infer them from traces, instruments, and models. In daily life, too, your nervous system performs operations before awareness catches up. Reflexes, perceptual corrections, rapid predictions, emotional tagging, bodily adjustments. There is much you do not witness, even within the system you call yourself. If hiddenness exists at this intimate level, it should not surprise us that the outer world contains layers we only indirectly reconstruct. That said, there is a temptation here that deserves resistance. Once a person becomes persuaded that reality exceeds perception, it is very easy to slide into thinking that every unanswered question is equally plausible. It is not. Some possibilities are better grounded than others. Some unknowns are strongly suggested by existing evidence. Others are merely imaginative. The discipline lies in holding openness and restraint together. Yes, there may be things here all along that we do not perceive. That does not mean every mystery points to a hidden realm of equal dignity. It means the world is under no obligation to fit the boundaries of human common sense, and that careful attention has often expanded those boundaries before. One of the healthiest responses to this is not fear, but patience. The unknown does not need embellishment. It is already enough that a room contains more than we sense, that an environment may carry signals not designed for us, that our own minds hide as much as they reveal, that other species prove the incompleteness of our slice by living competently in slices of their own. Once you accept all that, the world becomes more crowded in a very sober way, more occupied by processes, gradients, fields, and unnoticed interactions than everyday experience admits. You begin to see why the phrase "in plain sight" can be misleading. It suggests that sight is the relevant standard, that if something were really here we would see it unless it had been concealed, but plain sight is just one animal's phrase for one kind of access. A thing may be plain to a detector, plain to another species, plain to a trained observer, plain to a theory, plain to a model, while remaining completely unremarkable to an unaided human glancing up from a phone. The plainness belongs not to the thing, but to the relationship between the thing and the observer, and once the relationship becomes the focus, the question starts to deepen. If something can be present without being perceived, then what matters is not simply whether it exists, but what conditions would make it legible. Do we need new instruments, new concepts, different scales of measurement, more patient observation, better models of attention and error, more willingness to investigate anomalies rather than rounding them off? Hiddenness becomes less of a spooky property and more of a practical challenge. What are we poorly equipped to notice? And how would we know if we had begun to notice it? In that sense, the possibility that something is here all along is less a final claim than a change in posture. It asks for less certainty and more alertness. less confidence that the visible world is all the world, more curiosity about the quiet failures of the human interface. It encourages a person to look at familiar places with slightly less arrogance. The room, the street, the garden, the body, the sky, the air between things, none of them are exhausted by first appearance. They are working surfaces over deeper arrangements, and history suggests we have only ever been catching up. Which means the most reasonable answer may be the least theatrical one. Yes, something could be here all along. Many things probably are. Not because reality is hiding from us, but because human perception was never designed to reveal everything that exists. It was designed to reveal enough to move, enough to eat, enough to recognize one another, enough to survive, enough to mistake usefulness for completeness. And once that distinction settles in, the next step is not to chase the strange for its own sake, but to ask what reality might look like if the world were not filtered through the narrow practical settings that made human life possible in the first place. If human filters were removed, the first thing to say is that reality would probably not become clearer in the way people sometimes imagine. It would not feel like wiping dust from a window and finally seeing the world in perfect sharpness. That image is too flattering. Human perception is not a slightly dirty version of total access. It is a very specific operating mode, one that reduces and organises a staggering amount of information into something stable enough to live inside. Remove the filters entirely, and what you get may not be enlightenment. You may get overload. That is worth keeping in mind, because people often speak as though the limitations of perception are merely obstacles standing between us and a complete, beautiful picture. But those limitations are also what make a picture possible at all. The reason the world feels coherent is that your brain ignores almost everything it can afford to ignore. It compresses, it ranks, it stabilizes, it suppresses constant data, it enhances contrast, it predicts, it repairs, it groups, it names. It hands you a version of the world that can be acted upon without requiring you to consciously negotiate every signal arriving from every direction. So if those human filters were somehow stripped away, the result would not necessarily be a more comfortable truth. It might be something far harder to navigate. Start with the senses in the most literal way. Right now, the room around you probably feels manageable. A wall is a wall. Air is just air. The temperature is whatever you happen to call it. The background sound is either silence or one or two named things, perhaps traffic, perhaps a fan, perhaps the faint hum of your own home going about its business. But that manageable scene depends on brutal reduction. Remove the human boundaries on what counts as visible light, and the room would stop presenting itself as a neat arrangement of coloured surfaces. Suddenly heat signatures might become as obvious as shape. Ultraviolet reflections might alter the appearance of fabrics, dust, skin, plants, paper, painted surfaces. Light from electronic devices, indicators, and emissions currently outside awareness might begin to compete for attention. Reflective properties we never think about would become part of ordinary vision. The room would not merely contain more, it would stop looking settled. The same would happen with sound. Human hearing is selective enough that most environments feel organised into a few dominant sources. Without those limits, the acoustic world would become far denser. High-frequency vibrations from electronics, mechanical systems, insects, friction, small impacts, and movements now considered silent might become part of ordinary experience. Low-frequency rumbles from distant engines, weather, building systems, infrastructure, and subtle ground vibrations could become impossible to ignore. Rooms that currently feel still and quiet might reveal themselves as continuously active. Streets would not just be noisy, they would be layered with ranges and textures we never evolved to sort cleanly. Silence, as a category, might disappear almost entirely, and smell, which humans already underestimate, would probably transform daily life more than most people expect. If our chemical perception were radically widened, environments would stop feeling cleanly bounded by visible form. Spaces would acquire histories in a much stronger sense. A hallway would not just be a hallway, it would be recent passage, cleaning residue, old materials, incoming weather, food traces, human presence, plant matter, dampness, decay, airborne contaminants, and subtle variations in chemistry moving through air currents. People might become almost impossible to experience in the smooth social way we currently do, because every room would carry a far more detailed record of who had been there and what condition they were in. Much of what currently feels absent would remain present in a strong and immediate way. Then there is the matter of attention. Even with our existing senses, attention is what makes a world livable. You're not consciously aware of everything touching your skin, everything pressing against your body, every sound entering your ears, every edge in your peripheral vision, every internal signal rising from your organs. Human filters operate not just at the level of what can be detected, but at the level of what becomes experience. Without those filters, the problem would not simply be that more information arrives. It would be that far more of it demands interpretation at once. The visual field would not come pre-grouped into convenient objects. The background would not stay in the background. The body would not so politely withdraw from awareness. This suggests something important. If reality appeared without human filters, it might not resemble a better version of the world we know. It might resemble a loss of categories. Objects would still exist, of course, but the clean boundaries between them might feel less natural. We treat chairs, walls, cups, trees, clouds, and faces as distinct units, because the brain is highly skilled at carving the world into usable pieces. But that carving is an active process. At a lower or wider level of description, reality is less object-like than our everyday experience suggests. It is matter, fields, flows, gradients, interactions, frequencies, exchanges, and changes over time. The object is often the brain's practical summary of a more continuous situation. Imagine, then, a version of perception in which the summary weakens. A tree would no longer simply be a tree in the everyday sense. It might become at once a pattern of reflected wavelengths, internal moisture differences, heat exchange, surface chemistry, insect movement, fungal relationships underground, local humidity effects, subtle sound responses to wind, ongoing biological repair, and slow structural stress distributed across living material. The thing itself would still be there, but the category would lose some of its authority. You would no longer be seeing just tree, you would be seeing process. The same applies to a human body, and here the effect becomes even stranger. We're used to experiencing people as stable visual forms, animated by expression, posture, speech, and behaviour. Without human perceptual filters, a person might stop looking so cleanly self-contained. Thermal patterns would fluctuate across the face and limbs. Chemical signals would trail and linger. Micro-movements now ignored would become salient. Internal processes might become indirectly visible through heat, colour change, tension, pulse, breath, and other signals we currently register only vaguely. The human being would seem less like a neat social unit and more like an active system in continuous exchange with the environment. That last point may be one of the biggest changes of all. Human filters encourage the sense that things are separate. This object here, that person there, air in between, space around. But the more science has learned, the less final those separations appear. Bodies exchange particles constantly with their surroundings. Heat moves continuously, air circulates, microbes travel, sound crosses boundaries, electromagnetic signals pass through environments, chemical traces settle and lift, surfaces emit and absorb. The idea of isolated things sitting still in empty space is useful for daily life, but it is not the deepest description of what is happening. Without human filters, reality might look less like a room full of separate items and more like a field of ongoing interactions. Time would likely feel different as well. Human beings naturally perceive change at a middle scale. We are good at noticing movement that is neither too fast nor too slow, a thrown ball, a turning head, a cloud crossing the sun, a cup falling from a table. But much of reality unfolds outside that comfortable range. Some processes are too fast for direct awareness, others too slow. Without human filtering, if such scales could somehow be brought into present experience, the world would stop feeling temporally stable. Materials we consider solid and still would reveal themselves as busy with microscopic motion. Plants would no longer seem passive in the same way if growth and adjustment became more apparent. Weather would feel less like a backdrop and more like continuous motion in different states of intensity. Erosion, aging, settling, expansion, contraction, chemical change, all the slow processes that normally hide behind familiarity might become impossible to ignore. But there is another way to approach the question, and perhaps a more interesting one. What reality might look like without human filters is not only a question about more sensory data, it is also a question about less human interpretation. What would remain if the brain stopped so eagerly naming, sorting, and assigning meaning? We are constantly turning patterns into known things. That shape is a face, that sound is a door, that expression means annoyance, that delay means hesitation, that room is safe, that path is familiar. Much of this works well, but it also locks experience into categories built from habit, memory, and culture. Without those interpretive filters, the world might feel less certain in a deeper sense. The scene would still be there, but our immediate confidence about what it all means might weaken. That could be unsettling. A street would no longer be simply a street in the comforting conceptual shorthand sense. It would be a shifting arrangement of movement, signals, intentions, materials, routes, temperatures, sounds, risks, and repeated behaviours. A conversation would not just be words and responses, it would be timing, breath, emphasis, tension, social prediction, ambiguity, incomplete information, bodily cues, prior assumptions, and many opportunities for error in interpretation. Reality without human filters might not just look fuller, it might look less resolved. The tidy story we currently tell ourselves about what is happening would no longer arrive so quickly, and perhaps that is one of the hardest parts to imagine. We're not merely protected by sensory limits, we're protected by conceptual compression. The brain saves us from living in radical uncertainty by turning streams of information into stable recognitions. It assures us that the object is a cup. The expression is normal, the room is familiar, the silence means nothing, the day is proceeding as expected. Remove enough of that interpretive machinery, and you may not get a grand, complete truth. You may get a world that feels open-ended in every direction, rich with detail but poor in immediate certainty. This can sound almost negative, but it is not meant that way. There is something deeply valuable in realizing that human normality depends on a mission. It means the ordinary world is not exhausted by the ordinary way of seeing it. A field is richer than grass. A night is richer than dark. A body is richer than a person standing there. A room is richer than the place I know. The limits are practical, not final. Reality does not shrink when we fail to register it. It continues at full scale. Science, in a sense, is our best attempt to simulate brief escapes from human filters without being destroyed by the result. We build instruments to detect what our senses cannot. We create models to interpret signals we would otherwise discard. We translate inaccessible ranges into visible forms, graphs, sounds, numbers, and images. A thermal camera shows one hidden layer. A microscope shows another. A telescope shows another. Spectroscopy, particle detection, imaging techniques, audio processing, data analysis. All of these are ways of widening the slice without requiring the human brain to directly endure raw overload. We do not really remove human filters, we build better ones. That may be the most honest answer to the question. reality without human filters is probably not something a human mind could comfortably inhabit for long. It would be too much, too unstable, too dense, too unresolved. What we can do instead is compare filters. We can look at the world through different methods and notice how each one redraws what counts as obvious. Through one lens, a plant is green and still. Through another, it is full of internal transport and structural change. Through one lens, the sky is dark. Through another, it blazes with radio structure, infrared clouds, energetic emissions and background radiation. Through one lens, a body is warm skin and visible motion. Through another, it is electrical activity, thermal change, chemical signalling, constant microbial exchange, and subtle mechanical rhythms. Each added view is a reminder that the human default is not the final draft. Yet there is also a philosophical shift that comes with this. If reality without human filters would be less tidy, less object-centered, less silent, less stable, then perhaps the world is not fundamentally made for our style of understanding at all. Perhaps what we call common sense is simply the version of truth that fits animal life at our scale. Useful truth, actionable truth, local truth. Enough truth to survive and build a world of tools, stories and routines, but not the whole. That helps explain why so many major discoveries feel initially counterintuitive. The deeper structure often does not match the human version. We expect solids, but matter is mostly spacing and interaction at certain scales. We expect stillness, but there is constant motion. We expect clean boundaries, but systems overlap and exchange. We expect direct causes, but many effects emerge from networks, probabilities, and layered processes. The deeper picture can feel wrong precisely because human filters trained us on a simpler one. We did not evolve to intuit the universe. We evolved to navigate a narrow practical window of it. Even beauty might change without human filters. What we find beautiful is heavily tied to the scales, colours, patterns and symmetries our perception handles well. But a more complete reality might offer forms of order we're not naturally equipped to appreciate at first glance. Mathematical structure, frequency relationships, chemical gradients, dynamic systems, branching networks, wave behaviour, field interactions. Some of these already become beautiful once we learn enough to see them properly. That is telling. Education and instruments do not just add facts, they create new forms of perception. They let hidden order become emotionally legible. This is why knowledge so often feels like waking up rather than merely collecting information. A person learns about fungal networks in forests, the behaviour of light, the structure of cells, the dynamics of weather, the patterns in animal navigation, the hidden life in a handful of soil, and suddenly the familiar world stops seeming as plain as it did. The tree in the park changes, the night sky changes, the body changes, the kitchen sponge changes, admittedly in ways that may reduce one's appetite for a while. The point is that knowledge alters the filter. It changes what the eye sees even when the eye itself has not changed. So perhaps the best way to imagine reality without human filters is not as a single impossible state, but as a direction. A steady loosening of the assumption that what feels obvious is complete. A willingness to see the world as layered, translated, and only partially revealed by default. A recognition that the room is busier, the body stranger, the air fuller, the silence louder, the ordinary object more process-like, the familiar place more active, and the boundary between presence and absence much less secure than daily life suggests. And once you think in that direction, everyday certainty changes a little. The ordinary scene no longer looks fake, but it does start to look provisional. The default human picture becomes one rendering among many. Not worthless, not misleading in every detail, but partial in ways that matter. It is enough to live by, not enough to end the question. Which may be why the quietest and most unsettling possibility is not that reality hides some distant secret, but that the world right next to you has always been much more crowded, much more active, and much less completely translated than your senses ever let you know, and that what feels like emptiness may only be the edge of what the human mind knows how to turn into a world. By this point, the idea no longer sounds especially dramatic. That may be the most interesting thing about it. At the beginning, the suggestion that something might be hidden in plain sight can feel like the opening line of a mystery designed to make the ordinary world seem eerie. It carries the faint promise of revelation, of a curtain being pulled back, of the familiar room turning out to contain some astonishing secret. But after looking more closely at perception, at the brain's filtering, at the narrowness of the senses, at the ways other creatures inhabit the same environments through very different channels, the question begins to lose its theatrical tone. It becomes quieter, more grounded, and in some ways more unsettling. The mystery is not that the world contains strange things. The mystery is that we ever expected it not to. Human beings are so accustomed to the finished version of experience that we rarely notice how provisional it is. The room feels complete, the street feels complete, the body feels complete. Daylight appears to reveal enough, language appears to explain enough, routine appears to confirm enough, and before long we begin treating adequacy as totality. But the more carefully you look, the less convincing that confidence becomes. A place can be full of signals you do not register. A scene can contain patterns your brain never promotes into awareness. A person can be more complex than the model you carry of them. The air can hold traces, the ground can hold histories, the body can contain processes, the ordinary object can sit inside a web of relations far denser than the label you assign to it. The mystery is not far away. It is attached to everything you already touch. That may be why the most meaningful discoveries often feel so strange in retrospect. Not because they reveal an entirely separate world, but because they reveal more of this one. A microscope does not take you somewhere else. It brings hidden life into the same glass of water. A thermal camera does not invent heat. It translates a layer already present in the room. A detector does not create radiation, magnetism, or electrical activity. It makes legible what was already passing through ordinary space. The unknown, in so many cases, is not elsewhere. It is the part of here that had not yet become visible to the kind of animal we are. And there is something oddly comforting in that, once the first discomfort passes. The world is not empty. It never was. It is not exhausted by first glance. It is not limited to what enters awareness during a tired walk through familiar rooms at the end of the day. There is more structure, more activity, more relation, more continuity, more hidden evidence of other lives and processes than ordinary experience can comfortably hold. You're not standing in a finished picture. You're standing in a partial translation. That does not cheapen the world you know. It enriches it. It suggests that the ordinary scene has been undersold by the senses and reduced too aggressively by the mind. This changes the emotional character of everyday life in a subtle way. A room stops being just a room. It becomes a crossing point of histories, traces, currents, exchanges, temperatures, particles, habits, and unnoticed regularities. The body stops being just the thing you move around inside. It becomes a moving system in constant negotiation with an environment you only partly detect. A quiet evening stops being an empty interval. It becomes a version of quiet specific to human hearing, shaped by the thresholds and priorities of your nervous system. Even stillness begins to look suspicious. There is almost always more movement than you feel, more change than you track, more interaction than you name. Perhaps the most sobering part is that none of this requires fantasy. It does not ask you to suspend reason or accept grand declarations without evidence. It only asks you to take evidence seriously in the direction it already points. If human perception is partial, if the brain reconstructs rather than merely records, if other species detect realities that human beings do not, and if science has repeatedly shown that the world contains layers unnoticed until methods improve, then humility becomes the most rational response. Not fear, not gullibility, humility. The kind that says the visible world is real but incomplete. The ordinary world is usable but not final. The familiar world is stable but not transparent. That humility can be hard to maintain because people like certainty, especially close to home. It is one thing to admit that there may be unknowns in deep space or at the bottom of the ocean. Those places are already distant enough to hold mystery without threatening daily confidence. It is more difficult to accept that mystery may live in the house, the garden, the skin, the silence, the habits of perception themselves. We like the nearby world to feel settled because we have to function inside it. But function has always depended on simplification. You do not survive by perceiving everything. You survive by perceiving enough. Enough to avoid danger, enough to find food, enough to navigate social life, enough to make tomorrow likely. Nature did not shape the human organism to grasp reality in full. It shaped it to keep going. And yet, despite those limits, there is something moving about the fact that humans keep trying to see further anyway. We build lenses and sensors and theories and models not because ordinary perception is worthless, but because it leaves so much unanswered. There is a kind of dignity in that effort. A species built for practical survival keeps turning toward questions that survival alone did not require. What is in the air? What lives in the soil? What are stars made of? How does memory work? What patterns guide birds across continents? What is hidden in wavelengths we do not see, in frequencies we do not hear, in processes too slow or too fast for instinctive awareness? We keep widening the slice, knowing full well it may never become the whole. That effort also tells us something about mystery itself. The word often suggests darkness, confusion, or permanent unknowability. But many mysteries are simply invitations to improve the translation. They are not walls, they are signs that our current interface is incomplete. A mystery may begin as something overlooked, continue as something measurable, and eventually become part of the normal background of understanding. Then, almost immediately, new layers appear behind it. That is the rhythm of knowledge. We do not go from ignorance to completion. We go from one partial map to a better one, and then to another. The world remains larger than the drawing. There is also a more personal side to all of this, and perhaps it matters most. If the world is fuller than it seems, then attention becomes a moral act as much as an intellectual one. To notice more is not only to know more, it is to live differently within the ordinary. It means resisting the brain's tendency to flatten the familiar into summary. It means remembering that people are not exhausted by the roles your mind gives them. A parent, a partner, a stranger on a train, a neighbour seen every day. None of them are simply the category you have learned to use. They are active worlds of memory, sensation, interpretation, hidden stress, unnoticed change, physical process, and private experience you never fully see. In that sense, the quiet mystery beside you may often be another person, known just well enough to function socially and never well enough to be complete. Places deserve the same caution. Home can become invisible through repetition. Streets lose detail, seasons blur, objects become utility. But the loss is not in the world, it is in attention. There is always more specificity available than routine allows. Light falls differently day to day. Sound shifts with weather and time. Materials age. Spaces hold traces of the lives moving through them. The ordinary is never as static as it first appears. If you return to it carefully, if you stop long enough to inspect what your mind has compressed, the familiar can become strange again in a healthy way. Not hostile, just vivid. And perhaps that is the most generous use of this whole line of thought. Not to make daily life paranoid, but to make it more alive. A person who knows their perception is partial may become less arrogant in judgment, less certain that what they notice is all there is, less tempted to dismiss the unnoticed as non-existent, more willing to ask whether an absence in awareness is truly an absence in the world. That small shift in posture changes many things. It changes how we approach science because we expect hidden variables rather than assuming immediate completeness. It changes how we approach other living beings because we accept that their realities are not poor imitations of ours. And it changes how we approach our own experience because we begin to see consciousness not as the whole show, but as the curated front end of a much deeper system. There is, admittedly, a slightly humbling comedy in this. Human beings have spent a great deal of time walking around as though the visible and audible world were the official edition of existence. While bees read ultraviolet patterns on flowers, bats map darkness with sound, dogs move through chemical histories, and birds navigate using signals folded into the planet itself. We are clever enough to discover these things, and somehow still manage to act surprised that the universe was not designed around our preferred settings. There is something very human in that combination of brilliance and provincialism. We extend our knowledge by repeatedly learning that our first assumptions were too small. Still, that process of correction may be one of our finest qualities. We can notice our own limits. We can study the machinery that filters experience. We can build tools that reveal hidden structures. We can compare perspectives. We can learn from error. Even if we never escape partiality, we can become better at recognizing it. And recognition matters. A mind that knows it is seeing a slice is already different from a mind that mistakes the slice for the whole. One is closed by convenience. The other remains open to revision. The quiet mystery, then, is not a single thing. It is not one hidden object waiting for discovery, one answer that solves the discomfort and lets everything settle back into place. It is the ongoing fact that reality exceeds the version of it that human beings naturally receive. Sometimes that excess takes the form of undetected signals. Sometimes it is structure hidden by familiarity. Sometimes it is process hidden by timescale. Sometimes it is complexity hidden by category. Sometimes it is another creature's world, running alongside ours in the same physical place. Sometimes it is simply the unnoticed richness of a moment we had already decided was ordinary. That is why the mystery feels quiet rather than loud. Loud mysteries attract attention immediately. They break routine. They arrive as spectacle. Quiet mysteries do the opposite. They remain beside you because nothing in your system is designed to dramatize them. They can be present every day without forcing themselves into thought. The brain passes over them. Language reduces them. Habit domesticates them. They live in the exact places you stop examining first. The repeated sound, the ignored object, the familiar face, the stable room, the air itself, the body itself, the local patch of sky. Not hidden in the dramatic sense, hidden in the successful sense, hidden because the human world is built by not noticing everything. If there is a final lesson in that, it may be this. Mystery is not the opposite of reality. Mystery is often what reality looks like when our methods of access are still incomplete. The unknown is not necessarily elsewhere, and it is not necessarily hostile. Often it is simply what remains when perception has done its practical trimming and the world keeps going beyond it. To live honestly inside that fact is to accept both the beauty and the limitation of human experience. We get enough to love the world, enough to move through it, enough to study it, enough to be surprised by it, but we do not get all of it, and perhaps we were never meant to. That thought need not shrink us. It can make the familiar world more worth attending to. The garden is richer. The night is richer. The room is richer. The body is richer. The people around you are richer. Even your own mind becomes stranger once you understand how much it hides, invents, edits, and withholds while presenting you with the smooth story of a finished scene. The ordinary becomes less blunt. It acquires depth. It begins to feel as though reality is not a flat surface already understood, but a layered place in which every act of noticing reveals just how much has been living beside you all along. And maybe that is where the most peaceful version of this idea finally settles. Not in fear that something unknown is near, but in the calmer realization that the world has always been more than your first experience of it. More signals, more patterns, more life, more process, more history, more quiet activity, more unseen relation between things than the human mind can easily hold at once. The mystery has never needed to arrive from outside. It was already here, folded into the ordinary, waiting in the very places we call normal, not asking to be believed in without evidence, not demanding ceremony, just existing at the edge of perception like it always has, living beside us in silence while we move through a small bright slice of reality and call it the world.